Welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a sec here. Just getting everybody signed in. 10 minutes taken here.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes.
is there any way you can check the status on the National History Day stuff? Like, I've gone to the website to go look and I can't see anything.
Actually, they sent out the results. They emailed them to whatever email that you sent, but I have those. And I was actually going to send them out a little later today. But you're with the performance group.
Yes.
Yeah, that did Princess Noor, right? You
Yes.
guys won first place in the region.
That's
So,
great.
awesome job. Yeah. So I am actually gonna send that list out like this afternoon. So everybody will have the results. So great work. And you guys will get medals. And then of course you'll get to go to the state contest as well. Let's see here.
Yeah, my email was apparently my school email. I know Eiley sent us the results this morning, but I went to go look for it, and because it's my school email and it doesn't take outside sources apparently, I didn't get it.
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah, you must have it set up somehow because he sent it to my school email and it would work for me. So
Yeah, I went in there and changed the email this morning, but I don't know if it'll send it.
yeah, we did real well. We cleaned up. We had a lot of people place, so it was definitely a good year for us. You guys did a great job. Let's see. All right, I'm just trying to make sure I got everybody who's in here written down. Faith Engineering. Oh, there's two more. All right. Boyer and okay. We're gonna roll till 2 o'clock today. So if you have to leave early, just let me know. Not a problem. And just catch whatever you miss. And that is especially important for those of you who are taking the AP. All right. So I think this is where we left off. And fourth block people, I left my list of who has what slide at the school. So if I get to your slide, please say something because I will not have that in front of me. And there's Elizabeth. All right. So we were talking, I know this is a review for some of you guys in fourth block, but we were talking about how Germany built up its navy prior to World War I, and they did have a significant navy, by this point, but it's still, in terms of sheer numbers, it was no match for the British Navy. And so the British Navy, in a very smart kind of strategy, just put a ton of ships in the North Sea. So if the German Navy ever tried to venture out, it would be suicide. And there actually would be a battle where the German surface fleet would try to get out of the Baltic Sea and would get, the ships that tried to get out would get destroyed. It was called the Battle of Jutland. That would be later in 1916. So German engineers, who are famous for their ability to make things, they basically came up with a new way to get past the British Navy and do some damage in the water because, of course, Britain has a serious vulnerability. Being an island can be both a blessing and a curse. Can anybody tell me what is the benefit of being an island? But then again, what would the downside be? Go ahead, Ethan. I see your hand, and then I see Faith's as well, and there's Braden. All right, go ahead, Ethan.
Wouldn't the benefit be is that anyone who wants to reach you has to use naval force?
Yes.
But it also means that and if you want anything from anything else, you have to use naval force.
Okay. All right. And Faith, what were you going to add?
I was gonna kind of say the same thing. Britain's naval force was already great because they were so used to having to build it up because they had to use it to get anywhere anyway. But yeah, you would need to attack by water, and that would be a big benefit to someone who's already used to fighting on water.
Okay. And also, so when they put their troops on the shore of France, they didn't have to fight France, right? Because France was their ally. But there is another issue. Britain has a very large population. Industrial Revolution really had a lot to do with that. But they didn't grow enough food on their own island to feed their population. So if you were able to cut off what, you could actually starve Britain out of the war and make it so their troops would have no ability to fight. What is even more of an important target than the warships of the British Navy? Ethan, go ahead.
Supply lines.
Supply lines. Okay. So the German U-boats, and remember, these are the first generation U-boats. These are U-boats that don't go down very far below the surface. They have the little periscope, that comes up above the surface so they can kind of see where they're going and stuff. But they would slip past the British Navy because the British Navy wouldn't be able to see them. And then they would get out into the Atlantic and they would fire these bombs that had propellers on them called torpedoes. And that would basically make it so, British shipping was in serious peril. And they began sinking all merchant ships headed to Britain, most of which were British merchant ships from other parts of the empire. But they did allow American ships to go through without shooting those down. Why is that? Why would American ships be exempt? Yes, Ethan.
They don't want another person screwing up their Schlieffen plan when it already got screwed up.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're looking at kind of the logistics of trench warfare, obviously sheer numbers of men might make a difference, eventually. And of course, America had a large population and would probably join the war on the side of the Allies, especially if their ships were being sunk. So the U-boats become the terror of the Atlantic. And in the first 6 months of 1915 alone, 750,000 tons of British shipping go down to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So the British have to adopt a system called the convoy system. So there is kind of a battle of the Atlantic that goes on during World War. Nick, you have your mic on. Did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry. Well, I actually did want to ask a question. Why are they called U-boats in the first place?
It's German for Unterseeboot, which is for underwater boat. Unterseeboot is how you say it, but then the spelling I would have to look to see. And then Ethan, what was your question?
Yeah, I already kind of see a problem with this when basically, Americans' interests in making money and with British ships being sunk, there's going to be a point where a considerable portion of the food going into Britain is American liners.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And the British are going to have to get clever when it comes to how to get enough supplies in to their island to feed their own population, because they are growing some food, but they just don't have enough to feed everyone.
Yeah, and especially with the huge amounts of grain in America, that plays a part.
Well, yeah, and then but they've also got, the grain from other parts of the world as well. But yes, definitely America would be a lifeline, especially since there was a neutral country that Germany didn't want to draw into the war. But then also they have to supply their troops, and so trying to get ammunition, whether it be artillery shells or bullets, or equipment, etc., to their men, and food to their men who are in the trenches, is something that they're very, very concerned about as well, because the British army in Europe could be rendered completely ineffective if it weren't able to get its supplies. So a whole new facet of naval warfare is developed by German engineers in the U-boats, which are unveiled in this part of the war. All right. The airplane really becomes a significant weapon in World War I when a pilot because what pilots would do is they would fly over the other side's lines, and they had these crude bombs that they would kind of make, or they would drop these metal spikes, which are called flechettes, to try to hurt troops on the other side. But it was very haphazard. It was not until the very end of World War I that they actually developed bombs, that are similar to what we are familiar with, which bombing will become very important during World War II, but it really, in World War I, it's hardly a factor, and they won't develop until the very end, when it's kind of too late for them to really be a big use. But pilots would fly by each other, and they would pull out their pistols and they would try to shoot each other as they flew by, to recon, to kind of see where the other side's reserves were, etc. And so this one pilot by the name of Roland Garros decided that he was going to shoot down some German pilots by sticking a machine gun on the front of his plane. What's the problem with sticking a machine gun on the front of the planes that they had back at this time? Ethan, go ahead.
Question, was it fixed or was it like a turning turret?
It was fixed. So it would shoot in the direction the plane was flying.
Yeah, I'm guessing this is the part where you don't want to shoot off your propeller, and at first just make the propeller strong then.
Right. Okay. So and actually you're thinking right along the exact right lines there. You don't want to shoot off your propeller. And so what he did was he fixed some steel plates to his propeller, which he called deflector plates. So some of the bullets would get through, but some of the bullets would be deflected. And since, of course, the blades are kind of tilted, they would deflect off to the side. And so he goes up into the air and he tries it, and he actually shoots down a German plane. And the guys in the trenches who've got a kind of a front row seat to this are all cheering. And so he basically, makes a name for himself. And of course, he gets really excited and he can't wait to go out again and do it again. And he shoots out another German plane. And then eventually he will have mechanical problems with his plane, and they will happen while he is over enemy territory. So he'll have to land in German controlled territory and then kind of skedaddle out of there before the Germans can find him. And so when they find his plane, they figure out how he had been doing it. And they take it to a German engineer, Anton Fokker, who would basically, do kind of that same German engineering thing to airplanes that they had already done with U-boats. And he figured out a much more efficient and effective way to make this work. He basically had a little gear that would interrupt the firing of the gun whenever the propeller blade was in front of the gun. And so that was what was known as the interrupter gear. And so now both sides had airplanes armed with machine guns flying around. And of course, they would attack each other, and they would fly and dip and weave. And the guys down in the trenches would have a front row seat to what were known as dogfights. But it was being a pilot was now a very dangerous occupation, because you might have a couple of good days where you shoot down the other guy, but all it takes is one bad day and you're dead, because a lot of times, even if you jumped out with your parachute, the other pilot would circle back around and machine gun you to death while you were floating down in your parachute, so they wouldn't have to face you again. Yes, Ethan, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I don't even think most pilots even had parachutes at this time. They just didn't bother to give them ones.
Well, they gave every pilot a pistol, because if your plane catches fire, which is what often would happen when it got riddled with machine gun fire, it would the fuel lines would catch on fire, and so you would be a very painful death, as you would be burning as you kind of plummeted to the earth and crashed. So a lot of pilots would shoot themselves rather than die. But there were actually kind of your early makeshift parachutes that were employed by some pilots. So they did exist, and unfortunately,
But I think it's like that didn't really come into major practice until later in the war.
right. I mean,
The whole parachute thing.
they weren't standard issue right away. And it wasn't until later in the war that they became standard issue. So you are correct there, yes. And there are two aces of note. By the way, an ace is somebody who shoots down 8 other pilots. So if you shot down 8 other pilots, people kind of celebrate you. You get this nickname. They call you a fighter ace, and it's kind of like this badge of honor. So Max Immelmann is your first great fighter ace. He's from Germany, and he had shot down 17 other pilots before he himself was finally shot down. And Oswald Boelke was another one of the great fighter aces, with 40 kills to his name before he was finally shot down. And I'm going to show you a clip from the movie Flyboys, which is a Hollywood movie that basically details kind of like World War I aerial dogfights. And you're going to see, some advanced German planes which have 3 wings instead of 2. You'll see some of the first bombs that are kind of like, made to drop in a more effective manner, etc. But you'll also see kind of just like a picture of what it was like to be in one of these air battles. And by the way, pilots could also help ground troops during an assault by coming down out of the air and strafing enemy lines, but they would open themselves up to rifle fire from troops in the trenches when they did that. So there were pilots who weren't shot down by other planes. They were actually shot down by guys on the ground who were shooting up at them as they were strafing the trenches. So here is just a little picture of what an air battle would look like during the war. I gotta move everything here. All right.
Do something right.
All right. So you see some of the first kind of bombers that are developed, but those aren't developed until like nearly the end of the war. What did you notice in particular about the way the planes were painted? Anybody? Go ahead, Ethan.
They were kind of painted in the style of like, well, mainly how they would do like soldier uniforms. They kind of did more vibrant colors, so they're easily identifiable.
Well, actually, and wouldn't that be something that you wouldn't want, like where people could easily pick you out in the sky? Now, I know, Zach, we're getting into something that is going to be in your slide, so we won't get too far into it. But what were you going to ask?
The planes are painted red.
Yes. Now, they are painted red because of one pilot in particular who dared to paint his plane a bright, identifiable color, which was almost like a challenge. It was very easy to pick him out in the sky. And so, because he wanted other pilots to come and challenge him. And of course, which pilot is that, Zach?
That is the Red Baron.
That is the Red Baron. So what you saw there was a lot of people who were part of the Red Baron squadron. They called themselves the Flying Circus, and they would paint their planes bright colors like his because, you know, he had inspired them to want to, challenge other planes and not, try to blend into the sky, but to be, easy to identify. It's like, like saying, come at me if you think you can handle it, kind of thing. So those are your flying aces. And of course, that becomes another whole new facet of warfare. So you can see that technology is really not only reshaping the ground war, but is also shaping the air war and the war in the water as well. Go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, I think there's like some smaller tidbits of information I have about it. Well, one, I think it was like 3/4 the way through the war, some found out that you could just ditch the water jacket on the Maxim gun and just have a bunch of air holes in
Right.
it.
Yes, to cool it. Yes.
And another thing, I think they scaled up the original Maxim gun into a more heavy caliber
Right.
when it was for the 11 millimeter Grau
Right.
cartridge to shoot down balloons mainly. It wasn't actually good for air pilots.
Right, because they would go after Zeppelins as well. Yeah, and they started putting armor around the engine. So in order to effectively shoot down another plane, you had to have a higher caliber bullet as well.
Yeah, it's like those 11 millimeter are technically just big enough to put an incendiary material inside of it so you could just burn hydrogen balloons.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent additional points there. So those are your flying aces. And by this time, by 1915, the two alliances had kind of had some changes that were made to them. Before we get to the alliances, we need to talk real quickly about where the war was being fought. Since we, yes, Ethan, go ahead.
I noticed Italy did that thing it always does.
Yes, they'll do it in both world wars, actually. Yeah, so if you have a trench, it's kind of a stalemate. So if you can't go through the opponent, what would you want to do instead? If you can't go through them, go what?
Around them.
Around them, yeah, like what we talked about with the Battle of Tannenberg. So the two sides were constantly trying to flank each other. And so they would just keep extending the trench lines in order to not be flanked. And so the trench lines worked their way all the way up to the English Channel and all the way down to Switzerland, between Germany and France in Britain. And that became known as the Western Front. And a lot of what we talk about in World War I is going to be focused on the Western Front, because there are some important battles and innovations that occur there. But there's actually a much bigger front in the war, where a lot of interesting things occur as well. And that is between Russia, with its huge army, but rather outdated military equipment, and Germany in the north, and Austria-Hungary in the south. And there will be a third front, which will open up between Austria-Hungary and Italy, which I'm going to talk about here as we talk about kind of how the alliances shift. And so Britain had been having secret negotiations with Italy. And basically Britain was like, look, it would actually be in your best interest to fight Austria-Hungary rather than us, because yes, you might get a small slice of territory right here, but there are actual Italian people living in Austrian controlled areas, especially the Tyrol region, which is right there. And of course, having control of both sides of the Adriatic, having control of this coastline here would be much more beneficial to Italy than kind of anything you could get over in this region. So with offers of territory, and with kind of the realization that Germany was, locked in a struggle where they had to fight on two fronts, Italy decided to switch sides. So in the Secret Treaty of London, they basically agree to switch sides in return for these territorial promises at the end of the war. And so now the Allies have 4 countries on their side. But Germany had also been doing some secret negotiations. They had actually had some ships which had been chased into the Mediterranean by the British Navy, some battleships. And they had basically told the battleship commanders to just go into the Ottoman capital's port of Constantinople. And that is where they basically had negotiated. They had been negotiating with the Sultan, and they said, look, and actually really the Young Turks are really in control. The Sultan's more of a figurehead at this point. But they say to the Turkish government, look, we know you want to modernize your military. If you will join the war on our side, we will basically build you a navy. And these 2 battleships are a down payment with their crews in the brand new Ottoman Navy. And so the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of the Central Powers. So by the time we get to 1915, mid-1915, the Central Powers consist of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And the Allied powers consist of Russia, France, Italy, and Britain. And so that is, the longer this war goes on, the more desperate both sides get to kind of find some way to overwhelm the other side. So, but in 1915, it's all about getting a better alliance, getting more countries in there to kind of outnumber the other side. But you'll see that even that isn't able to overcome the stalemate of the trenches with the machine guns. All right, and that takes us to the Armenian Holocaust. So in 4th block, someone already did this, but in 6th block, I believe this is Zach's. And there's Scott. This is Zach's slide. So since he's not on the Zoom call, I'll do it. But essentially, if I had kind of a map, I'll roll back here really fast just to kind of give you an idea on, because usually I use the maps on the wall in my room. But the Ottoman Empire up here in the Caucasus region, if you see where my pointer is, had some people living in it who didn't take advantage of kind of the option to convert to Islam, which gave you all kinds of advantages in society and allowed you to advance and do things and not have to pay certain taxes, etc. And because they had historically been Christian from ancient times, and these were the Armenians. And so the Armenian people kind of held on to Christianity as part of their culture, part of their identity. And as the Ottoman Empire entered the war, they were afraid, especially the Young Turks, that the Armenians might be what we call a fifth column, which is a whole group of traitors that they might, because of their historic Christian kind of faith, that they might side with the Europeans who were mostly Christian. And so, and they had disliked the Armenians previous to this, and there had been spasms of violence against the Armenians, just like Christians versus Jews in certain parts of Europe. And so the Turkish government just decided in 1915, starting in 1915, that they were going to exterminate the entire Armenian population. And that's not just able-bodied men who can fight, it's every man, woman, and child. And we have a term for this, which was actually developed during this particular incident. What is the term for trying to wipe out an entire race of people? Yes, Ethan.
Genocide.
Genocide. Okay, so essentially, this is the first genocide of the 20th century. It's the forgotten Holocaust, because whenever we talk about Holocausts and genocides, we always focus on World War II because just of how unbelievably, brutal that was. But this one in many ways was as well. It just, there weren't as many pictures getting out, sources, etc. But essentially there are three stages to this. So the first stage is where they want to get rid of the Armenian leaders, okay, the people who might unite the Armenian people and help them fight, their intellectual leaders, etc. And so about 600 Armenian intelligentsia were executed by these murder squads that would just go around and hang people. Here's a picture of some of them being hanged, and would shoot them as well. But when you're talking millions of people, you're talking about millions of bullets. And that's logistically actually a lot of just sheer supplies in order to wipe out an entire population of people. And so they began looking for ways to efficiently kill large numbers of people. I'm going to roll back to that map real quick just so you can kind of see. So on the Black Sea coast up here, like there are some big cities like Trebizond and some others, and they basically would take Armenians and pack them shoulder to shoulder onto barges, which are these big, kind of platforms that are drawn through the water with cargo on them. And they would then just sink the barge and drown huge numbers of people. So that's kind of considered phase 2 of their, way of trying to eliminate the entire population of the Armenians. But that wasn't efficient enough. And of course, it couldn't be applied in other parts of the Ottoman Empire where the Armenians lived. And so their third major way of eliminating the Armenian population was to march people, just force march large numbers of people, every man, woman, child, out into the desert. And there's kind of a big desert in between the various arms of the Fertile Crescent, and the Ottoman Empire kind of encompassed that whole area. And so that desert is in kind of the eastern part of Syria, western part of Iraq now. And they would just have people sit there, and they would, get more and more desiccated as time went by, and then eventually they would die of thirst and starvation. So this is a mother and her son who are basically, becoming victims. And of course, you will see images like this again when we talk about the Holocaust in World War II. So when this was over, about 1.5 million Armenians had been killed. Some estimates run as high as 2 million. Yes, Zach, go ahead.
So how were people able to take pictures of this without the government being like trying to stop them?
Those pictures that we do have, which are few and far between of this one, because most of the pictures we have of the camps from the Nazis are the ones that were taken after the camps were liberated. These pictures were taken of people while they were kind of in these situations, these force march situations. And those were done by brave journalists and some soldiers who disagreed with what was going on, and their way of kind of protesting without getting themselves killed was to snap a picture and then smuggle it out. And so we do have some pictures, but there aren't a lot of them. And again, this is maybe why the Armenian Holocaust is more the forgotten Holocaust than because of the sheer amount of media that we have of the World War II Holocaust. And of course, we actually have footage of, when American and British forces, and even when Russian forces would go into these camps, they would just turn on a camera and just film everything because they were so shocked by all of the atrocities being committed in them. So that is the Armenian Holocaust. And the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war really does create a problem. Russia is going to have to split its forces now and fight on another front, which is kind of the mountain range that is in between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, called the Caucasus Range. So there's another front that develops. So there's a front between Austria-Hungary and Italy that develops, and then a front between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. But Britain is like, these people aren't even Europeans. Like we've been beating them, and everybody else is got their hands full. Like France and kind of your regular British army, they've got their hands full on the Western Front. Russia has its hands full on the Eastern Front, and Italy now has its hands full fighting Austria-Hungary, kind of on that new front developed in the Alps. So the British were like, they have a capital that's really close to water. All we have to do is just drop an army in the kind of the land area close to their capital and take it. We can bombard, with our ships, with the guns on our battleships, we could bombard their capital and break down the walls, etc. But where are they going to get the troops from? Anybody have any ideas? Like, where else can Britain get troops? Ethan, go ahead.
From one of their many numerous colonies.
Okay. And Nathan, what were you going to say?
Is it India?
Okay, they have Indian troops that are of some use. There is some fighting in the colonies during World War I, but mostly the troops that they're going to bring in are white troops. So where in the colonies do they have large numbers of white people living? Ethan?
Australia.
Australia is one. What are some other areas? Think close to us. Come on, what's right north of us?
Canada.
Yeah,
Canada.
Canada. Yes, Canada is still a part of the British Empire. Elizabeth, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, I just raised my hand to say Canada. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. And there's one more. It's close to Australia, and it has a majority white population as well. Yes, Ethan.
New Zealand.
Yes, New Zealand. Okay, so they're going to fight this battle against the Ottoman Empire with what they called Anzac troops. So you see the acronym here: Australia, New Zealand, and Canadian troops. Okay, so these Anzac troops are brought in from around the empire, and basically there's a couple of preliminary things they have to do to get to Constantinople. The Dardanelles Strait is a potential problem for any ship, because up on the heights above the Dardanelles, there are these large artillery guns, which could just basically blow a hole through your ship, drop shells right on top of ships. And so those artillery guns had to be taken out before ships could go through the Dardanelles and get to Constantinople. So the British land their Anzac troops on the beach, and then they order their men. They say, okay, we want you to basically kind of go up this hill. So yes, it is similar to kind of like Bunker Hill, you know, the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812, where the British are just like, hill, who cares? You know, we're going up against troops that are kind of cruddy anyway. We can do it. You know, so there's a little bit of pride here, you know, in how the British, you know, just decide to go straight up, you know, because at the top of the hill are entrenched Ottoman forces. And of course, when you're going up, you know, a pretty steep incline towards entrenched forces, it's usually not going to work out real well for your guys. But the British are like, they aren't even European. We beat them all the time. It should be no problem. So they land their troops on the beach, and they charge up the hill. And the Ottomans have some machine guns set up, but they're relatively disorganized. And the British are able to kind of push them back, and it looks like the British are going to take the heights. But one of the young Turks, one of the officers that was part of that coup against the Sultan that kind of established this military junta, which was in charge of the Ottoman Empire, really, had come to the front personally. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and of course he's going to become very important later. But Mustafa Kemal saw his men kind of just folding and running, and the British were advancing, and they were going to take the heights. And once they took the heights, that was it. All those guns were going to get taken out. And so Mustafa Kemal gets really kind of intense. He says to his men, I don't just order you to turn around and fight. I order you to turn around and die. We are not going to lose these heights. And so they brought in more machine guns, set them all up, and, you know, just mowed down these British troops that were coming up the incline. And so they were able to hold the heights. And so the British had to dig trenches as a way to kind of defend themselves against this hail of gunfire. And we kind of had another stalemate that developed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. But the British were like, this is not, like, these aren't even Europeans, you know, like this shouldn't be happening. So there was a lot of pride in the way the British commander, Lord Kitchener, kind of operated. But he essentially sent wave after wave after wave of young men to their deaths, to basically try to take the heights on this peninsula. And it just, you know, it never worked. So for over a year, the British would just send wave after wave after wave of Anzac troops at the Ottoman machine guns. And even though they did kill a lot of Ottoman troops with artillery and shooting them and things like that, they were never able to break the Ottoman lines. And so the Ottomans were able to hold the heights, and eventually the British would have to retreat kind of shamefully, and hand the Ottoman Empire, which was considered weak and considered, you know, not up to the level of the rest of, you know, the great powers, hand them a big victory. Just like the Battle of the Marne, there are more casualties in this one battle than in the entire wars previous to this. So 285,000 casualties for the British. And remember, there's no antibiotics. So a lot of those bullet wounds turn into gangrene when they get infected and people die. And 250,000 for the Ottomans as well. Over 500,000 men were casualties in just this one battle. Yes, Scott, go ahead.
They still keep their navy there so they could keep launching artillery.
Yeah, and they had the big guns. That was actually where a lot of the Ottoman casualties came from, was where the big guns from the battleships would like launch shells. So some of the artillery fire that was hitting the Ottoman trenches was actually from ships. But once you get so far in, really, and you're out of range of naval artillery, it wasn't as effective. But yeah, naval artillery was used. And Ethan, go ahead.
Was this around the time that the whole like British naval plan of we need to build like, was it 16 or 18 more dreadnoughts or something like that?
That was the Tirpitz plan. And then, of course, you know, during the war, they were continuing to try to build ships, but they had a lot of other priorities during the war as well. And resources had to be kind of shared with the army, which was fighting on two fronts. Yeah, that is mostly prior to the war. but yeah, there is a plan. I think you are correct that there is a plan to build more of those big battleships, the dreadnought class battleships. You know, and of course the dreadnought. That's all AP Euro. I mean, we're hitting highlights here. We're not really getting into like a lot of the detailed. The more detailed version would be, you know, AP World, AP Euro. But yeah, that is definitely part of that naval struggle, the surface navies as well. I do think it's helpful to watch a short clip from a movie. One of Mel Gibson's earliest movies when he was young, back in the 80s, was a movie called Gallipoli. And there's basically this kind of tragic scene in the movie. Mel Gibson and his friend, you'll see this character, I don't know the actor's name who plays his friend, but they had joined up kind of to see the world when they were both from Australia, and they were, you know, they were going to go on an adventure. They were going to go fight in a war, you know, because, you know, the casualty counts usually in wars were pretty low for the Europeans. And so, you know, they didn't realize what they were getting themselves into. And so Mel Gibson had lucked out, and he had gotten the job of message runner, because there were little lines that were used to send messages, but they would often, these little telephone lines would get cut by bullet fire. And so he was running a message up to a commander who was basically, you know, going to send his friend over the top and have him run up against the machine gun fire. And he was trying to get there before the message went through. And I don't think I've ever seen, I mean, there are some scenes from like War Horse and some other recent movies that have been made about World War I, like 1917, which are also good. But I don't think I've seen very many Hollywood clips that really encompass how tragic and futile trench warfare was. So I want to play this real quick here. Of course, you can hear the 80s music. Kind of fun. There's Mel Gibson's character right there.
It does sound pointless to go on. On the other hand, excuse me, sir, British are ashore at Suvla. Are they meeting heavy opposition? None, sir. Apparently they've called a halt and the officers are sitting on the beach drinking cups of tea. Tell Major Barton the attackers. Now just tell him that I'm reconsidering the whole situation. Sir.
Notice the telephone lines and the guy trying to repair them there when they get cut. These guys are getting ready to go over the top. So because they know that they're most likely not coming back, they put all of their possessions on their bayonet knife and they stick it in the side of the trench, so letters can be sent home to relatives and things like that.
Not gonna make us go, are they? No, there's no point.
This guy right here is Mel Gibson's friend throughout the movie.
Those men should have gone, Barton. Marker flags have been seen. Not by me, sir. I've asked for confirmation from General Garden. The orders are to attack, and you'll do so immediately. The British at Suvla must be allowed to get ashore. Is that clear? You are to push on. It's cold-blooded murder. I said push on. Cast meant to do, I wouldn't trust them. All right, men. We're going. I want you all to remember who you are. The 10th Line Horse. Men from Western Australia. Don't forget it. Good luck. Flexibility. You too.
To your legs. Springs. Still springs. What are they gonna do? You're gonna hold me down the track. How fast can you run? Fast as a leopard. How fast are you gonna run? As fast as a leopard. Then let's see you do it. Get away! Get away! Get away! That's your message! Get away!
So yeah, the silhouette from that becomes kind of like the symbol for the movie right there. And it just kind of captures how pointless and sad it was to just kind of send all these young men to their deaths kind of over and over and over again as the you know, as trench warfare just kind of drags on and on and on, and neither side wants to kind of admit defeat, so they just keep sending the men, and it's just a tragic slaughter. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Do the soldiers have tons of alcohol? Because I'm sure that was very stressful and they wanted some relief.
Yeah, I mean they did, and you know, a question that a lot of people have asked is like, what makes these guys not just, you know, say no, I'm not going to do it. You know, like because like you saw one character say it's cold-blooded murder. Kenzie, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say, I'm just confused onto how they just kept sending waves when they couldn't tell that, like, at least after two, they should have realized that they weren't gonna get anywhere with it.
Right, and you know how like the reason for it was because there were troops landing in another area, so they had to put pressure on the Turkish lines to kind of distract the Ottomans, so the troops in a different area could land on shore safely. And you know, of course, because the communication lines had been cut, the one commander didn't know that the top commander was reconsidering the whole thing, because it was you know, like he said at the very beginning of that clip, it was just pointless to go on. But yeah, a lot of the blame for just the incredible waste of life is going to come on Lord Kitchener's head. Lord Kitchener had actually made a name for himself as kind of this no nonsense tough guy who had won against some very difficult colonial fighters in the Boer Wars in South Africa. but his reputation is just absolutely destroyed by his lack of um, caring about all these lives that he was wasting. Ethan, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, this is on a related note. I think it's like some like data that they found in like World War One of that there wasn't exactly a total average agreement between officers and soldiers firing. That they found that the percentage of like when soldiers actually charged and fired on command from an officer is somewhere only like 32%.
It all depends on what part of the war you're talking about.
I
Either
think that was Western Front.
yeah, and it like, but it depends on like how late in the war we get, because the later we get in the war, the more everything starts to break down. So there's another scene in this which we didn't play, but in that scene, one of the guys refuses to go over the top. Like everybody else, this is like in a previous wave. Everybody else goes over the top, but he refuses. He stays there, and all of his fellow soldiers look at him, and he's just got this look of incredible shame on his face, because he is a what is the thing that no guy wants to be called when they're
Coward.
a coward. Yeah, they're like, you're a coward, you know. And so the utter shame of that really just kind of hammered into him. So you know, in the next wave he went, and of course he died. So that is one of the things that drives people. But you're going to see as we get further and further in that military discipline is going to break down, like Ethan was saying, and that troops are going to mutiny after a while, especially on the Eastern Front. So we're going to be talking about that when we get to 1917. So right now we're in 1915, but every year that the war drags on, the stress cracks within every one of these countries get wider. Like the weak places, the fault lines, I guess you could say, the cracks get wider and wider as the stress of this war is just tearing, you know, militaries apart, tearing countries apart, and just everything seems to kind of come unraveled as we get close to the end. Go ahead, Ethan.
I think the main thing is like some historians that shows how direct human psychology can affect the way a war moves.
Yeah, and especially in this war where like it's mostly fought with men, you know, like in other words, you know, as we get further in to warfare in the 20th century, you're gonna see more machines doing a lot of the fighting. You know, when we get to World War II, we'll see a lot of, you know, mechanized warfare. But when you have all of these lives being snuffed out by the sheer industrial power of war, it really does have a terrible effect on just the ties that bind people together. And people are just like, why am I doing this? Why am I wasting my life? You know, kind of thing. So along that line, and also along the line of a trend we were talking about, where both sides just are like, you know, we used to have kind of this gentleman's code of honor, you know, you don't shoot prisoners, you don't do certain things in war. But as they get more and more desperate to win, both sides, those rules start to go out the window as well. We keep going further and further down this slippery slope of total war, to the point where, you know, utterly barbaric things are happening, like, you know, like the Holocaust in World War II. So the Second Battle of Ypres is actually right up on the English Channel. It's like it's a Belgian town, like right near the edge of you know, where the English Channel is. So this is always like there's a number of battles here, because if you can break through here, you can flank the other side. You can go around the end of their army, so to speak. So the Germans decided to basically toss the prohibition that had been already signed internationally against a new kind of weapon that had been developed by scientists, poison gas. They just decided to toss that out the window. And in the Second Battle of Ypres, they launched 5,700 canisters of chlorine gas at the British lines, and the British were not prepared. Nobody had equipment to defend themselves against poison gas. By the way, what is the equipment that you would normally have to defend yourself against that? Ethan, go ahead.
Gas masks.
Gas mask, yeah. So nobody had
Which
gas.
there were many of designs, I think.
Yeah, and right, and all of it all depends on what kind of gas you're trying to defend against. But chlorine is like, if you've ever smelled, you know, kind of like at a public swimming pool or something, kind of that really intense smell, that is only a tiny amount of chlorine. But like as a gas, it's kind of yellowish green, and it oxidizes any mucous membrane. So you know how your eyes get red if you kind of open your eyes underwater in a pool? Well, imagine, you know, kind of the full concentration of chlorine against your eyes. What happens when chlorine gas interacts with a mucous membrane, which would be like the surface of your eye or the inside of your nose or the inside of your mouth? It creates this chemical reaction. This is called oxidization, and it just burns and kind of like it chemically burns things, and so you would lose your eyesight, and you become blind, or you know, you would be choking and coughing, and the more you did it, the more the gas would get inside your nose and mouth, and it would be just a horrible way to die. So they do open up a giant hole in the British lines. Ethan, what were you going to say?
I think it was like the reason why chlorine specifically, because it reacts with water in your eyes and in your lungs to create a hydroxide and hydrochloric acid, which basically would give acid burns to everywhere it touched water. However, because chlorine gas reacts with water, it can't, I think, go as far as other gases
Okay,
because it
yeah,
can
like,
react with stagnant water in the air.
right, that's true, yes. But yeah, it's the first chemical weapon, and you probably have more knowledge of like kind of the actual chemistry of how it reacts than I do. But yeah, it was. So I don't, if you see this picture right here, all of these soldiers have blindfolds over their eyes, and they have their hand on the shoulders of a soldier in front of them. There's just an entire line of people who've all been blinded, and they're just, you know, that's their new reality. It's a new wound of war, so to speak. Now, sometimes if you close your eyes quick enough and you don't keep opening them, you know, in spite of the burning sensation, the blindness would be temporary. You would regain your sight to a certain extent, depending on how long, you know, you were exposed. But it just another, you know, kind of horrible casualty of war. And so, just to get back to the battle, there is a kind of a big opening. But the Germans, who did have some gas masks, they charge, and the wind shifts and it blows the chlorine directly back at them. So some of the Germans who weren't quick enough with their masks, or who didn't have masks because they didn't have enough for everybody, you know, they ended up suffering the same fate as some of those British soldiers. But the Germans do break through, and had it not been for a Canadian regiment that was behind the lines and kind of stepped up and filled the gap and stopped the German advance, this could have been a much, you know, more important battle than it was. Really, the most important reason we remember this battle is because it is the beginning of using poison gas. Because once the Germans do it, are the British and the French going to do it too? I mean, why wouldn't you? You know, yes, Ethan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, the horrible trend beyond these is that once one person breaks international conventions, then everyone else breaks it because, oh, why would I stop myself if that guy's gonna do it anyways?
Right. Yeah. It's just, you know, right. Exactly. So, I mean, once one side does it, the other side does it too. And then we get further and further down that slippery slope of total war. Yes, Nick, go ahead.
Was there any like opposition from any other people serving in the German army about using the gas, or was it just, oh, we need to win no matter the cost?
Were there any objectors, conscientious objectors to that?
Yeah.
I'm sure there were. I'm sure there were. I just can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there had to be some people who were obviously, upset with the, breaking of international convention, the loss of kind of human rights, I guess you could say, for these soldiers. So that's an excellent question. I would have to look and see in German society who might have been kind of the most prominent person to speak out against that. But it doesn't stop there, because once chlorine is used, like, both sides manufacture tons and tons of gas masks, and everybody gets a gas mask. Yes, Nick, did you have another question? Or do you?
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
Oh, no problem. Ethan, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just wondering if you're about to go into like phosgene, because I looked into a little of both,
Okay.
because technically they do relate to chlorine in ways.
Yeah, if you want to give kind of your some of the insights you have on.
Yeah, I'll just wait till you go over them first.
Oh,
and
okay.
then I'll
All right.
add.
So anyway, the next kind of evolution of poison gas was something that was colorless and relatively odorless. Although you'll notice on these little posters here that they had for soldiers that it had a slight smell like musty hay. And phosgene was something that would just replace oxygen in your bloodstream. And so essentially you would breathe it in and it would just replace oxygen, but you need oxygen for your brain and other organs to function. And so very quickly you would go into kind of this deprivation of oxygen thing and you just fall over. So the only way to really know that there was a phosgene gas attack happening was you'd start to see lots of people fall over, and then everybody would get their gas masks on really quick. And then Ethan, did you want to add to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, so it was like looking at the chemical composition of phosgene. It's very simple, similar to chlorine, because basically what they did is they would basically in chemical structure, you break apart the chlorine and stick a carbon monoxide in between.
So it's kind of like
So the carbon monoxide is the reason why it's colorless. And yeah, it's basically works similar to has similar effects to cyanide, but doesn't work in the same way.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
It doesn't
interesting.
stop
So
oxygen reaction.
kind of like, yeah, oxygen deprivation, kind of like carbon monoxide. Like if you were in your garage and you left your car running, it would asphyxiate you. Yeah. So, all right. So, and then the third one is the granddaddy of all of the chemical weapons that we now have, like sarin gas and all the really horrible stuff that we now have in our arsenal, and it's called mustard gas. And mustard gas basically it had a very distinct odor, smelled like garlic, but also kind of like mustard, had a very sharp odor to it. And it wouldn't just attack mucous membranes, it would attack any exposed skin. So if you were in the middle of a cloud of mustard gas, giant sores would appear all over your skin, and you would basically just it would eat into you, and you would of course be occupied with that rather than being a soldier. And so you had to have heavy clothing that covered everything from head to toe in order to survive a mustard gas attack. So as miserable as the trenches were, this just added to it and just made it even more miserable now. Kind of the dealing with poison gas. Faith, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, with mustard gas, so like if you breathe that in, like you can't get your gas mask on in time. So would it just be burning the outside of your body and the inside of your body?
The incredible amount of pain you would be going through just from one breath of that would just be, fantastic. And of course, your immediate reaction to that is to cough and to try to like get it out. But then of course you have to take another breath in, and it's almost involuntary when you take another breath in. And when you do, you just bring more gas into your nose and into your mouth. So people who didn't get their gas masks on in time died horrible deaths, because it just, once you get to a certain point, you just keep coughing and just it's just a bad way to go. Ethan, go ahead. Ethan, you had your hand up. I'm not. Oh, okay, there you go. Yeah, your internet connection I think might be a little slow because you're kind of like breaking up. All right, I'm not hearing
Yeah.
anything. Oh, there you
Can you
go.
hear me now?
Now, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so mustard gas was by far the most complicated one of them all. It was basically the culmination of the idea of, them being, it's like, okay, chlorine gas works well. We need to stick as much chlorine as we can into one molecule. So basically, this is what it was. What they did is they attached chlorines to carbons, and then they attached like a string chain with chlorine tails, sort of, with a sulfur atom at the very center as like the binding. And
That's
it
what
worked
gave.
in a composite. It worked in a composite sort of way. It was multiple reactions at once on your skin. So first, basically, at first it would break those tails of the chlorine off, and that's chlorine in of itself, which is painful. But then it then turns into what is known as a sulfonium salt, which basically it would sort of like pucker onto your skin, deposit there, and then it would turn, and then once it puckers onto your skin, it would turn to hydrochloric acid, which would then cause acid burns.
Yeah.
And basically just continually pumps hydrochloric acid over and over again onto your skin.
Because it just keeps making it in the reaction that it creates, the chemical reaction.
Yeah, the problem is that it lasts very long in that reaction.
That's just.
So once it
just
gets
sounds
on
like
you,
a-
it's not coming off.
Yeah, it just sounds like a horrible way to go. So yeah, I feel a lot of sympathy for the soldiers that ended up getting caught in these attacks, and of course, the trenches are just becoming just this nightmare. Like this, it's just everybody wants to go home, everybody wants to leave, but nobody can because then the other side will win. Um, all right. So, an important event, especially when it comes to America's involvement in the war, is the sinking of a passenger liner. So, according to international convention, passenger liners were not military targets. And basically, the RMS Lusitania was off the coast of Ireland, and U-20 surfaced on February 4th, 1915, and shot one of its torpedoes at the Lusitania. Now, when it hits the side of the ship doesn't just get a hole in it. There isn't just like a small explosion and then there's a hole and then the ship starts to slowly sink. There is a massive explosion. Like it almost literally rips the ship in half. And it takes only 18 minutes for the ship to then capsize and sink. And of course, there's all these passengers on board, many of whom are non-combatants, children, old people, etc. And 1,198 people die, including 128 US citizens. So when media outlets share the story of just the incredible human tragedy of these all these people who died, it really does raise the kind of the temperature, so to speak, in America about possible involvement. Like people are getting angry, and that kind of edges the country closer to the war. As a matter of to possibly getting involved in the war, although our stance is very much neutral still. But William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State, was so worried that we might end up going to war that he resigned his position as Secretary of State in protest over kind of the shift in American attitude after the sinking of this ship. Go ahead, Ethan.
Was there any response from Germany? specifically not wanting America to enter the war from this when they found, oh no, there were U.S. citizens on that board.
We're getting to that actually, because President Wilson is going to issue an ultimatum to Germany, and Germany is going to have to capitulate. So you are anticipating what we were just about to get into. So very, very good question there. Nick, go ahead.
Why is just Germany being so ruthless? Like they're just kind of shooting literally anything on sight, and they're also, of course, resulting to gas. Like, what's driving them to be so all or nothing?
That's actually an excellent question. Does anybody want to answer that before I go? Go ahead, Ethan.
I think in their mindset, they think this as, I have to do everything that I can to exist.
Yeah, they're fighting a two-front war. They're desperate. Like they know that they're at a huge disadvantage, because their one huge advantage that they had was that very large, well-equipped army, but they had to take it and split it. So half of it was fighting Russia and half of it was fighting France and Britain, and they just need to get an advantage on one side. Like if they could just get Britain out of the war, then then they could win on the Western Front. Then they could take their armies and go and face the kind of endless amount of men that they would have to face fighting Russia. And so it's born out of desperation to a certain extent. Germany is just desperate to not have to fight on two fronts, and they feel like they're fighting for their very existence, like Ethan was just saying. Now, one other question: why does the ship blow up like that? Why does it like literally rip in half? The only other kind of similar explosion that we've talked about like that was the USS Maine. Go ahead. I think Nick, you forgot to put your hand down, but if you didn't, go ahead and say something. But Ethan, what do you think? What is the reason why possibly the Lusitania blew up like that?
Well, I think at the time they practiced, like, yeah, you have on one hand, it's like, hey, on this passenger line, there's all this extra space down near the ship. What do we use it? Hey, can you send some supplies to our friends near Britain,
Okay,
which were probably ammunitions.
Okay, Max, what did you want to add to that?
I was just gonna say they probably like hit the fuel or maybe the engine or something. Maybe like a boiler exploded.
Okay, well, yeah, but really, Ethan is got kind of like, what a lot of historians think is that the Lusitania was basically being used to smuggle ammunition, from one place to another, because they're trying to supply their troops, and they're having a hard time getting supplies through because the U-boats keep sinking all the ships, the transport ships, which carry this stuff. So they were trying to use passenger liners to kind of smuggle it. So that, of course, is another significant problem. Now we're going to come back to this. So Ethan, we will be answering your question about America and our involvement and all that. But before we do, we need to come back to the Western Front. So we are now getting into 1916, and the Germans are really hitting a point of desperation. They know that if they don't find a way to turn this war around on either one side or the other, they are just going to be ground down to nothing. Like, they have to win on one of the two sides, and the easier of the two sides to win on, in their opinion, since they were already so close, was the Western Front, because they're relatively close to the capital of France. So General Erich von Falkenhayn, who was the chief of the German army chief of staff, he basically was like, okay, we're going to use an old method, but it's a relatively effective method. Germany had been blessed with a huge kind of population boom. They had a lot of soldiers. And at this point in the war, they still had a numerical advantage on the Western Front. And so he says, what we're going to do is we're going to attack a fortress that we know they won't give up. Like that's a strong point on their kind of defense, their line of defense. And that was the fortress at Verdun. And we're going to just basically send our guys in there knowing that a lot of them are not coming back. We're kind of sending our guys in there to draw the French into just a slugfest. And we're going to lose men, but so are they. And we're going to make it where we use artillery and poison gas and things, so they lose more men than we do. So for every 3 German soldiers that die, 5 French soldiers are going to die. And his exact quote is, we're going to, quote, bleed the German army white. So like if somebody like cut one of your major veins or arteries, like, and you bled out, your skin would become very white, because it very pale, because all the blood would be gone. So basically, what is he trying to do to the French army? He's trying to make them run out of something. Ethan, what is that? What is he trying to make them run out of?
He's basically just doing the basic war of attrition.
Yes, very good. I was going to ask what the word was for that, and you just said it. So excellent. Yeah. So this is attrition, which has been used, in other battles. It's basically where you're just trying to make the other side run out of men. Like that was used against some Native American tribes, where they would just say, okay, well, we know there's like X number of warriors in this tribe, so let's just keep getting into battles with them until they're almost running out of warriors, and then we can force them onto a reservation. So why is this so cold-blooded though? Like, why is this such a move of desperation? Yes, Ethan. And well, actually, Faith, since Ethan, you've answered a lot, I'll let Faith go first. Go ahead.
Well, honestly, it's just barbaric that he's just sacrificing so many of his own men. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like, it seems like he doesn't have an issue with that at all.
Yeah, and maybe he does, but he's like, at this point, we're that desperate. We want to win so bad that we're willing to sacrifice a lot of our own men in order to make the French and British. So this is actually a long-term strategy, and you have to see everything that happens after this, as you have to keep in mind that Germany has this kind of long-term strategy of attrition, of basically making it where the British and the French are just literally going to run out of guys, because Russia ain't going to run out of guys. that is not going to be an issue for Russia. Russia can keep pouring in guys for a long time. So if they're going to make one side run out of guys, it has to be Britain and France. And so everything else they do is kind of like focused on making this work. Now, this battle will actually go on for almost an entire year. I think it's like 11 months. Yeah, 11 months. And it's actually going to be more of a 4 to 5 ratio. So the Germans lose 434,000 men, and the French lose 500,000 men. So it is like 934,000 casualties, and just like the trenches literally filled with bodies in some spots, and there was like, this was like a fortress that had like some underground parts and whatnot. And just the horrors from this battle are just like, we could spend a long time on it, but we just don't have the time. But that is the Battle of Verdun. Now, I'm sure you've probably heard the name Lawrence of Arabia before. Because there was a famous movie made about it in the 1960s. I don't know if that rings a bell or not. But that's a real person. And actually a brilliant person. His name is Colonel T.E. Lawrence, and he was so well versed. I think he spoke 7 languages. He was so well versed in Muslim culture, and could speak their language so well that the British sent him down as an ambassador. They knew that there was an old kind of rivalry between the Ottoman Turks and kind of the Saudi Arabs, who had been conquered in the 1800s, in the first Arab-Saudi War. And this area, this kind of leg of the Ottoman Empire is a part of the Muslim world known as the Hejaz, Hejaz, and it contains like 2 of the holiest places in all of Islam. Anybody, what is the holiest place in all of Islam? Ethan, go ahead.
Mecca.
Mecca. All right. And Anybody know? I don't expect a lot of people to know this, but what is the second holiest place in all of Islam? Because Mecca is where they have the Kaaba, which has the black stone in it, which, and it's like, where Muhammad said this is the symbol of Allah. But just a little north of Mecca is a town called Medina. And that was where actually Muhammad spent a lot of his life. And Medina is where he was buried. So there's actually a mosque there around his tomb called the Dome of the Prophet. And so those are two very, very holy places. And of course, if you're a Muslim, once in your life, you're supposed to make the Hajj, which is that pilgrimage to Mecca. And so instead of trying to go right at the Ottoman capital, which had been a failure, they send Lawrence of Arabia down to negotiate with the Arabs. And he negotiates with Sharif Hussein. And because of his appreciation of Arab culture and language and whatnot, he is actually able to establish kind of a friendly relationship with the Sharif Hussein and is able to get them to agree to revolt. And the price for this is that once the Arabs kind of, help the British revolt or help the British in their attempt to break up the Ottoman Empire from the other direction, they will get their freedom after the war. Because of course the French and the British have their designs on the rest of the Middle East and kind of plan to make colonies out of it. So that is Lawrence of Arabia, who does successfully get a revolt going among the Arabs in 1916. And then British forces are able to land, and with the kind of the combined Allied force is able to then take the city of Jerusalem in 1916. They're working their way up through kind of the heart of the Ottoman Empire as a result. All right, and that takes us to Zachary's slide. So Zachary, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can you hear me good?
Yes, and I will get your email pulled up when you're ready. So just tell me when you want me to jump over to it.
Okay, well, I figured we could just do that. Watch the video once I'm done.
Okay.
Explaining everything. So the Red Baron was the name given to Manfred von Richthofen.
Richthofen is how you say it.
Richthofen? Yeah. Okay, yes. Richthofen. Okay. A German fighter pilot that ended up being one of the deadliest in the war. He had ended up shooting down 80 Allied aircrafts in his career. And that's 80 airplanes. That's 80 planes he shot down. He was called the Red Baron because he had a very bright red colored plane, or like whenever he needed a new plane, it would always be painted red, a really, really bright scarlet red.
Yeah, and that was at a time where everybody was like had their planes kind of like a light blue, or a white, so they blended into the sky. And he was the one guy like at the beginning. Now, of course, later on, like you saw in the movie Flyboys, more and more pilots would do what he was doing. But for a little while, he was the only guy who was red in the whole sky, so you knew who he was. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
And this paint scheme was literally just a challenge to enemies to try and take him on, because he was so good. He just was basically trying to just rack up those points.
And he was very competitive. Like, he just wanted to see if there was anybody who was good enough to beat him. But what is his he kind of was different than a lot of other pilots. Like another pilot might, like if you were in a parachute and you were floating down, they might come around and machine gun you to death.
That's what I'm going to get to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I won't say anything. All right, go ahead.
This is actually my next sentence. He had a very strict moral code, and he only participated in fair fights. So if something had happened where the enemy ship, he could or not ship but plane, the enemy's plane had been having problems and it had nothing to do with the shooting, he would back off and he would let them win and they'd get fixed so he can attack them later at their best. And then also he would not go around and swoop and finish them off, because that was just a part of his moral code.
Yeah, he only wanted to fight fair fights. So like this is kind of like an exception to that trend. You know, the trend is total war. Everybody's just throwing out all of the conventions of warfare. Like people are like shooting prisoners, and they're not following the rules, so to speak. But here's one guy who is an exception to that. He follows the rules, and he only wants to win if it's a fair fight. Go ahead, Ethan.
I have a question for Zach. Did any part of the military thought of it as a psychological attack of painting many of their planes red because any one of them could have been him, and basically you were destined to fail against him?
Well, at one point, he actually ends up taking a command of like brightly colored ships, and they're called the Flying Circus, and that was a bunch of people that had painted ships like him, or painted. Why do I keep calling them ships? Planes. They had a bunch of planes that were painted the same, like different colors, but like bright like that.
Yeah, because they wanted to imitate him, because he inspired them. Like they're like, I want to be like you, so I'm going to join your squad, and I'm going to paint my plane bright colors too. A lot of them imitated him and painted theirs red.
So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a military strategy. It was just people like to be like him.
Yeah. Elizabeth, did you have a question for Zach?
Yes, I did. So he had this like real morals and sense of honor, right? Did that like ever catch on to other people that he worked with, or other people that looked up to him and stuff, or was it really just a him thing?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I would assume that it could pass through some of his like people that really like to follow him.
Okay.
I would assume that it would a little bit, not as much, but a little bit.
If you get into the history of the Flying Circus, which is like a whole nother rabbit hole of history, there are people who do what he does. They imitate him, and they imitate his code of honor. But there are people within the Flying Circus. There's one who had his plane painted black, and I can't remember his name, but they were ruthless, and so they just wanted to win at any cost. And he kind of was like, he didn't like them as a result of that, but they were still part of his squadron. Dylan, what were you going to say?
Were his morals religiously backed?
Zach, any do you have anything on that?
I actually did not find anything about that particular spot.
I don't know the answer to that one either. All I know is he kind of had this sense of like fairness. Like he didn't want to win if it wasn't a fair fight, and he was like, if it's a fair fight, you ain't gonna beat me. Like I like you. I'm so good that nobody will beat me. All right, so he becomes like a hero, like a national hero in Germany. And the German government begs him not to fly out. They're like, please, just stay home this mission. Like you are such an inspiration to everybody in the country. You're helping troop morale so much. If you get killed, and so, but he would always go out. Like he would always, but nobody was ever able to shoot him down. So Zach, I don't know if there's anything else you have before we get to.
I have a lot more.
Okay. All right. So go ahead. I'll stop interrupting you. Go ahead.
So at the beginning of World War I, he was actually in a cavalry unit. So like it was on horseback, but it ended up, and he even ended up receiving the Iron Cross. But cavalry ended up becoming obsolete due to the machine gun, which we had saw earlier in one of the earlier battles. And so then he transferred to the Air Force. And to mark his growing kill count, like as he would get like in battle and he would take them down, he would have a German jeweler make a collection of small silver cups that had the date of each victory on it, as like a remembrance, I guess, or as a token of his battles. And he had actually endured several close calls during his career, but the first serious war wound he endured was on July 6, 1917, when he sustained a skull fracture after being grazed by a bullet. And he actually never fully recovered and he had complained of frequent headaches, and he was also, well, scientists believe, but it makes sense that he was also probably suffering from PTSD.
Okay. All right.
And then I got more on his like last battle.
Okay, yeah, that's where I was gonna like kind of wanted to get to, was like, how did he finally die? Because no other pilot ever shot him down. He dies a different way. So tell us about that.
So his final fight took place on April 21st, 1918. And at this point, the British really wanted to take him down just to completely demolish German morale. Because everyone knew about the Red Baron at this point.
Yeah,
everyone knew he was a huge status symbol.
They had entire squads that were dedicated just to killing him. Like that was their sole mission. Yeah.
Yep. And so when the Flying Circus had ended up engaging a group of British planes over Vaux, I think it was called Vaux, Vaux-sur-Somme.
This is part of, yeah, but this is part of the Battle of Amiens. But yes. It's just details. Let's just kind of get to the important parts of the story here.
Yeah, okay. So the Red Baron swooped in low to pursue an enemy fighter, and then he actually ended up coming under attack by two Australian machine gunners on the ground. So they were firing up at him into the sky as he was also engaged with another plane, another Canadian pilot. And he was hit in the torso by a bullet. And to this day, people are still debating whether or not it was a bullet from the Australians on the ground or if it was the Canadian pilot that had shot him in the chest. And he died after crash landing in a field. The credit was given to Brown, but I would think it'd be cool if it was the Australians that had ended up doing it, because they were on the ground shooting machine guns up in the air, just trying to hit him, and they did. Wow.
Yeah, because the bullet is like I think it didn't have like an upward trajectory or something like that, and that's what gives credence to the theory that it was coming from the ground or something like that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. So it's either Roy Brown of Canada or it's these Australian machine gunners. But I think, as he was chasing these pilots, his machine guns were strafing the lines a little bit. So, of course, the guys down in the trenches, had every right to kind of defend themselves. But that's the famous end. I think they ran over, when they saw the plane in the sky, it was kind of black against the sun, so they couldn't tell, who it was. They were just shooting up at a plane that was kind of coming in their direction. And then when they came over to the site and they saw the color of the plane, and they then identified the body, then they realized who they had shot down. So or who had been shot down. Yes.
But one really neat thing I found out about this, he was 25.
Yeah.
He was 25 and he shot down 80 planes.
Who he kind of reminds me of is like a Tom Brady type person. He's just like super competitive. He's a goat. He's just like, I'm the greatest, and like, come at me, try to beat me, because I love the competition, but like nobody ever could. So that is the story of the Red Baron.
And then I have a quote from him.
Okay, go ahead.
It is fight on and fly to the last drop of blood and the last drop of fuel to the last beat of the heart. So that just shows that he was, everything about him was in that battle.
All right.
It wasn't just a battle to him. It was his like career.
Yeah, like he was just all consumed with it. He was so competitive. So just excellent job, Zach. And let me jump to your video here. Search your name; it'll be faster. All right, if the internet will cooperate, there it goes. All right. And how long is this, Zach?
Maybe 5 minutes. You don't have to play the whole thing. I just thought it was interesting.
Okay, yeah. Is this from like a movie or is this more a documentary?
Yeah, it is. It's from the Red Baron.
Oh, the movie, The Red Band. Okay. Oh, YouTube. Oh, I wonder if YouTube's gonna have problems here. You might. Seems like we're having slow internet or something. All right, well. So thank you, Zach, for that. Kind of a cool little clip there. I haven't seen before. All right, so that is the Red Baron. Excellent work. And that takes us to the Battle of the Somme. And I know somebody has this in one of the classes.
This is my slide.
All right. Okay, so Jacob, I'm going to let you get started here. This is probably the most famous of all the battles of World War I. So go ahead.
All right, so the Battle of the Somme, which is sometimes called the First Battle of the Somme because later in the war there was a smaller second battle that occurred in this area, was on the Western Front. It occurred between the British and the French versus the Germans, and is considered one of the bitter and most bitter and costly battles of the entire war. So the British military at this time was mostly made up of brand new volunteers. They just volunteered, and this is their first battle they'd ever fight in the First World War. And as was typical of the British and the French at the time, before the battle even started, they started a week-long artillery bombardment.
So this is a little shift in strategy, though. Like, instead of just sending, remember how we were talking about in Gallipoli, where they just sent wave after wave of guys at the machine guns? What are they now? They're like, instead of wasting men, we're going to waste what? Like
artillery shells. They wasted
artillery
wasted 1.75 million shells of artillery.
Okay.
Because what they were hoping is they were going to try and collapse the German trenches and destroy the barbed wire, but their shells were largely ineffective at doing that, and their German trenches were a lot farther underground than they previously thought.
Well, and Germans just like to build things. They're just like great engineers, and they had built these little concrete lined bunkers that the machine gunners would be the first people with them. Like, whenever there was a bombardment, the machine gunner is the most important person, so he and his equipment would go down there first. So that proved to be very effective in terms of defending against this very long bombardment. Ethan, did you have a question for Jacob?
Oh, do you actually have details on how the German trench lines looked?
No, I do not have details.
Okay, I just wanted to add them if you didn't.
Okay. Did you? I mean, just keep it relatively quick and short.
Yeah. So basically, there was a huge disparity between British and German troops. Basically, Germans had this like 3-lock system, where there's like, it's usually then there's like the very bare bones front line, then there was the mid line where most soldiers had like canteens and stuff, where they actually beat like huge underground tunnels. And then the back line was where communications, and then before communications and like I think more large arms storage, and then behind that was artillery fixation.
Yeah, so that's kind of a pretty common way of structuring trenches. So Jacob, go ahead. We'll
All right.
Stop interrupting you.
So after 8 days and 8 nights of bombardment, the British attempted a charge across the no man's land.
What did they tell their men about this? They're like, after we bombed them for an entire week straight, nonstop, day and night, not even what?
I didn't read anything about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just, I have it here in the slide. Not even a cockroach is going to survive. Everything is going to be dead on the other side. Elizabeth, did you have something you wanted to say? Or I'm sorry, Kenzie. Kenzie, you were
I was just going to say the cockroach.
Yeah, not even a cockroach will survive. It'll be like a walk in the park. You know, and a lot of these young guys that were now being recruited were being recruited out of Ireland, which was part of the, the British Isles at the time. So, they're like thinking, okay, we're going to walk across no man's land, and everybody on the other side is going to be dead from all these artillery shells. So Jacob, what happens?
Barely any of the Germans were killed during the bombardment. Especially the machine gunners had one of the bombardment side hidden in the concrete bunkers. So when the British charged them, they were sitting in their concrete bunkers, and 58,000 British were killed by the machine gunners and other riflemen.
Because when the bombardment stopped, they realized, well, that means that they're coming. Like, we got to get our machine guns out. We got to. and we got to go up and put them up there. And so, yeah, that is the single largest loss of life in one day, I think, so far in this war. 58,000 men just mowed down as they tried to come across. So then the battle kind of extends out, and it goes, into months and months and
Yeah,
months.
it lasts from July 1st to November.
Okay.
Like
So any
November.
other details about kind of like what the British strategy was, like what happened, etc.?
Well, so after the bloody first day, they very rarely tried. They stopped doing the large push attacks and they tried to do smaller attacks to try and prevent those large losses of life at a time. And while the British to the northern part of the Somme were because of the bloody first day failed miserably, the combined French and British farther south had actually seen some small successes.
Yeah, they
And
moved the lines a couple of miles, I think, right?
Yeah.
I have it on the map there. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's what happened in trench warfare and war attrition. You move the lines a few miles at a time.
Yeah, and that was about it. Like, I mean, that they go for months and months and months, and they all lose all of these young guys. They all died or were wounded badly, and then they just got a couple of miles, and that was it. I mean, it's just the endless stalemate of trench warfare. Do you have anything else on the Somme?
So towards the end of August, the Germans had actually started to lose morale because they were losing lots of support. The British and the French kept on bringing more guys in, and they replaced the German general Falkenhayn with Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Yes, from Tannenberg, from the Battle of
Yeah.
Tannenberg. They get promoted up because they actually won, so.
And another small detail, around September at the British actually first deployed the first time tanks were ever used on the battlefield.
Yes. Okay. And we're about to get to the invention of the tank. We're going to talk about it when we talk about the Battle of Cambrai. But this is an attempt to find some way to, go against machine gun fire, with an armored vehicle. Olivia, You've been waiting patiently. Did you have a question for Jacob?
Yes, just like a small question. Would you consider this one of the largest battles? Because I'm just looking at the end of the slide and the amount of casualties at the bottom is insane to me. I was just wondering.
Yes, this is probably one of, if not the bloodiest battle of the First World War, and definitely saw some of the highest casualties and the bitterest of fighting.
Yeah, and so we're over 1 million men with the casualty count there, because it's 200,000 for the French, 420,000 for the British, and 500,000 for the Germans. And just remember, this is an offensive. Okay, so this is where the British and the French who are helping them are basically going on the offense against the Germans. And while this is going on, the German offensive at Verdun is also going on. So there's like two different offenses. Like one is an Allied offensive against the Central Powers, and the other is a Central Powers offensive against the Allies. But neither one can break the lines, so to speak. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a thing talking about how the French actually had to pull some of their forces out to go back and reinforce Verdun.
Yes, and that's
because
go ahead.
That's one. Then I was reading and taking notes. It talked about how that was a slight reason why the British saw some even more casualties, because the French had pulled out some men.
Yeah, and that's why this ends up being really more of a British battle than because it was originally going to be more of a combined offensive. Yeah, because of Verdun, they end up having to. Now, just one more thing, because bombardment is now becoming the new favorite strategy, just bombarding trench lines with artillery. Soldiers now have a new horrible reality to deal with, and that is trying to survive a bombardment. So let's say either you're in lines where you didn't build good concrete bunkers, or you're not one of the important people who gets to be in the bunker. The only other way to survive a bombardment is to move sideways, okay, in a trench. So essentially, when a artillery shell is going through the air, it makes a whistling sound. It goes, and it's coming down, and you can tell if it's coming closer to you, if it's getting closer, by how loud it gets. And so guys who were trying to survive bombardments would move sideways, like when they heard it getting louder, to try to avoid it. And then, but imagine trying to do that for an entire week straight, where you would, you would have to be able to sleep sometimes. And if they're going day and night, because that was their whole strategy, was to make it so like the German soldiers just would be exhausted to the point where they couldn't avoid it anymore. Just think about like the amount of PTSD you would get if you managed to somehow survive that. We're going to actually talk about like the first diagnoses of PTSD after the war, they're called shell shock. And people are literally just, they're shaking so much they can't even walk, they can't even like just function like a normal person, because they're so like their nerves are so frayed to the point of just, you know yeah, go ahead, Nathan, what were you gonna say?
Maybe completely wrong about this, but wasn't like shell shock like a pre-form of before? That's my dog. I'm sorry. Before people figure out like what PTSD was.
Right. Yeah, and the guy who literally created the entire field of psychology, Sigmund Freud, pioneered his cure, because he was a prominent European kind of scientist at the time, and he pioneered what he called the talking cure, where he would sit somebody down on the couch and they would walk through what was driving the reactions they were having, and help that he would help talk them through what they're dealing with, as a way of trying to overcome PTSD. Dylan, go ahead.
Why hadn't shell shock been a bigger thing in past battles?
Just because of the sheer like mechanization of warfare. Like it is now, like, because of the introduction of like just massive amounts of firepower, and just with the machine gun and the artillery shells, warfare was so stressful and so like it pushed you to the point of like literally not being able to handle it mentally, that you really start to see the effects. Now, not to say that there aren't effects previous, people especially who were in hand-to-hand combat and saw terrible things. It's just, I mean, people who were in the Civil War suffered, from PTSD.
This is more just on like a larger scale.
On a larger scale, just lots of people. Actually, I have videos. I'm going to show these at the end when we get to the end of the war, of people who are patients who are suffering from shell shock. Faith, go ahead.
I was just kind of add on to what you were saying with like
Yeah.
warfare previously. The only thing that like made that kind of sound was cannon fire. And while that was loud and everything like that, the bombings were constant. Like they didn't stop at night, like it wasn't like you got a break at some point in the day. It was just a constant thing of, I don't know if this bomb is going to hit me next. I don't know where the next one's going to land.
Well, and it's just
So,
also what you
yeah.
see, like things you can't forget, like people being
Yeah.
or like people.
Yeah,
like,
you're sitting in the trench and your friend who you've been talking to for the past several weeks gets blown up right next to you. It's not
Yeah.
pretty.
And then, I mean, and not to say that it doesn't happen in previous wars, because when you're fighting in hand-to-hand combat with people, like, and you kill somebody, or somebody, that is killed, like right in front of you, you can't get that out of your head. But it was on a larger scale, like we were just saying. Ethan, go ahead.
Kind of going to the theme of how Germans basically do anything to try and get an edge in warfare. Was this before drugs were soldier enhancing drugs were even tried, or are there like some bare bones stuff
Really,
attempted here?
the stuff that I have read about enhancement drugs like meth, which was developed by the Japanese during World War II to keep pilots awake, that really is mostly World War II. Mostly. So again, you're going to see, people kind of pioneering all these new little pathways in their desperation to win these wars.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those drugs were just in comments as like, we can't have people break down. So it's like, how far can we push a person? We basically saying that you just need to cloud their mind so that they can continue farther.
Some people everybody deals with it differently, and some people deal with it better than others. So it just depends kind of on how you were raised. There's so many factors that go into how people deal with it, but yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead, Scott, what were you going to say?
Isn't related to drugs at all, but like literally a million people just died in this battle. Did they have like programs going on in their countries to have women reproducing a ton to make a bunch of kids?
Really, you're going to see that in World War II more. Like there's going to be like, well, and in between the wars, Hitler is going to promote that. Like, you know, girls are going to be told in the Hitler Youth to their whole job in life is to have lots and lots of Aryan babies, because they want to get their soldier population up. But like you're like if you had a kid in the war, like they would still be a kid by the time the war was over. Like you wouldn't, you can't produce instant soldiers. So but in between the wars, you're right there, you're definitely going to see that. Ethan, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
So uh was water logging of trenches a issue in this battle?
We're going
Like
to
water flooding trenches.
we're going to get to a battle where spring rains make a huge difference. So you are actually anticipating a battle in 1917. So we're still in 1916, but yes, I mean you're going to have rainstorms come in, and like the trenches are like the perfect petri dish right now. Like you've got chemicals from, you know, poisonous gas, you've got chemicals like from gunpowder and explosions and body parts and just, you know, and human waste and everything just kind of like all there all the time. And yes, rain comes through and just wets it all up, and there's bodies everywhere that haven't been buried. And you know, it's just yeah, that I'm not like when we get to the flu pandemic of 1918, I'm of the opinion that, because there are different theories as to where it actually started, I am of the opinion that it was a mutation in the trenches itself, but there are some competing theories on that. But it is just, yeah, it's just not a great existence. Ethan, go ahead.
Wasn't there a designation for like usually people is like these midnight crews that had to drag in the bodies
Yeah, right. You
from
would
the
go out because you would crawl out into no man's land, and you would have to kind of crawl on your belly because if the guys from the other side saw you, they would shoot you. You know, because at this
I
point,
think though at some parts there was like semi-agreements like, okay, I have people who has to come out and take the bodies, you have people who has to come out and take the bodies.
earlier in the war, that's true. And actually, like if we were doing AP Euro, we would do like a more detailed version of World War One, and I would have the Christmas troop of 1914, where in the early part of the war, the German and French troops basically, or German and British troops, like who are just like about a football field away from each other, they start singing Christmas songs, and then they come out and they play soccer for a while, and they just forget about the war, and they, you know, like the fact that they're supposed to kill each other on Christmas Day. So you see those things earlier in the war, but as you get further and further into the war, and as it gets more and more desperate, they'll just kill you. Like normally, you know, like you say, here's my sword if you're an officer, and you surrender formally, and they're supposed to take you prisoner, and there's like certain rules about how you're treated. As we get further into the war, they just shoot you. They just don't care, because they're just so desperate to end this endless nightmare. Yes, Ethan.
Yeah, I gotta go right about now.
Okay.
I don't know if you're gonna get to my slide, the 1918 flu pandemic.
Okay.
If so, I'm gonna try and like make a backup slide.
Yeah, just grab just like think of something that you want to do, and we'll get you with the backup slides. Yeah. All right. We do need to jump back over to the United States for a minute, because we talked about this with moral diplomacy, where President Wilson had intervened in the Mexican Revolution. Well, when he basically so kind of here's how the Mexican Revolution went. Porfirio Diaz, very conservative guy who was like, you know, on the side of the rich people. He had been president for a long time, but he was forced out of power by these caudillos, these warlords who had emerged, one in the north, Pancho Villa, and one in the south, Emiliano Zapata. And they had basically forced him out of office and had brought in a guy named Francisco Madero, who, like we mentioned earlier, was going to do things like land reform and take land away from rich people and give it to poor people so everybody could have a more equal share of the riches of Mexico. And Madero was assassinated by the military who kind of staged a military coup in favor of the rich people and installed Victoriano Huerta as the new president. So the caudillos, Villa and Zapata, had forced Huerta out. And this is when they tried to bring in a guy named Venustiano Carranza. And Carranza had promised to do what Madero had done. But once he gets into office, he kind of waffles on it. He becomes, a typical politician and says, well, I didn't really mean that. And he becomes much more moderate, which means rich people are going to get to hold on to their land. And so Pancho Villa and Zapata are basically at this point like, okay, fine, if you're not going to do what the poor people want, then we're going to remove you too. And so it was at this point, because the Mexican Revolution had started in 1911, under the cry of, land and freedom, tierra y libertad. And it had been going for 5 years now, and it was just chaos south of our border. It was at this point that Woodrow Wilson intervened in a big way and sent American forces to invade Mexico and basically support Carranza. And he's like, enough. Okay, this guy is going to do things for both sides. We're going to step in and say, for the sake of the people, and for human rights and to get this craziness to stop, we want Carranza to be president. Well, actually, he's kind of screwing over the poor people when he does this, because they wanted land reform and now they weren't going to get it because the US was backing Carranza. So as retaliation, Pancho Villa invades our country. He comes across the border into the United States and attacks the town of Columbus, New Mexico. So this is one of those rare instances where like somebody has come across one of our land borders and has actually attacked us. He burns down the town and kills 17 Americans. I mean, what has he committed here? Like, essentially, an act of what? When you cross our border and kill American citizens. Yes, Scott.
Act of war.
It's an act of war. So General Pershing, who I'm sure the name sounds familiar, basically is like, okay, well, you want a war, you got one. But we're not fighting the Mexican government. Okay, so we're actually helping Carranza, because Carranza's biggest problem now is Pancho Villa in the north and Zapata in the south. And because they're trying to remove him because he won't do what the poor people want. And so essentially, with Carranza's permission, General Pershing basically invades northern Mexico and chases Pancho Villa all over the deserts of northern Mexico and the mountains. But Pancho Villa knows the terrain way better than we do. It's kind of funny. There's actually movies that have been made about this, because Pancho Villa had like a movie producer following him around, and he tried to make himself into this kind of heroic figure, but did a lot of bad things too. But eventually, after kind of fruitlessly chasing him around for a year, American troops are going to be needed elsewhere. I'm not going to say where yet, but that kind of ends our involvement. And Pancho Villa will later die in a battle against the Mexican government, which of course is still getting support from the United States. Yes, Faith.
All of this is happening during World War One, like
Yeah.
in Europe. So
Yeah.
were a lot of the people in Europe, like Germany and like all the Allied forces over there, were they happy about this? Because like we
Oh.
were distracted by Mexico, so they
Oh,
were like,
okay.
well, we don't have to worry about it now.
They actually, you are asking a great question, because what's going to happen is they're going to try to distract us to keep us from getting involved. Because what plan is going to get screwed up if we get involved on the Western Front? Remember the German plan,
Plan.
not the Schlieffen plan, which has already been screwed up. But what, Scott? What plan is going to get screwed up? Go ahead, Scott.
And they can't grind down their forces if they have a whole other country coming on.
The attrition. Remember, they're going to bleed the French and the British army white, like basically make them run out of men. If America gets involved, it'll just be an endless supply of men. So in order for their strategy to work, they want to distract us. So Faith, you are actually anticipating something they're going to try. A little diplomatic note they're going to send, but I won't say anything more about it right now. But that's an excellent question. So That is Pancho Villa. And it's kind of funny how many crazy things are all happening at the same time, you know, in this, in what's going on here. All right. And that takes us to the Brusilov offensive, which I know in one of the classes, someone picked this. Oh, yes, it is Connor who's not here. So I'll take it. And then Connor can pick a different one. So essentially, the guy who figures it out, because all of the generals had just been racking their brains trying to figure out, how do I break the trenches? How do I break the trenches? The guy who actually figures it out is a Russian. He's a general over on the Eastern Front, and he's fighting the Austro-Hungarian army. His name is Alexei Brusilov. And what he does is, I often draw this on the board, but I'll kind of do it like on camera in the air here. He does what's called a creeping barrage. So instead of just firing at the enemy trench lines like you do in the Somme, you fire out into no man's land, and then you fire a little further, a little further, a little further, a little further, until you hit their trench lines. That is to conceal men who you have following your barrage. So like when everybody goes down into their little bunkers, because everybody was doing the bunkers now after, you know, they had heard about the Somme, after the machine gunners go down into their bunkers because the artillery shells are hitting, when finally the artillery barrage is over with, they come back up. Who's standing right there waiting for them? Those troops that had been following the creeping barrage. They call these guys shock troops, okay? They're like kind of like your first special forces kind of troops. And they had been like basically following the barrage. So when the machine gunners come up and they're like, okay, I'm going to set up my machine gun because I know they're all coming across no man's land, the guys, the shock troops are just right there, and they're like, bam, you know, and they kill them. And so they basically wipe out a huge number of Austrian like installments, like machine gun installments all across the Austrian lines. And then they're all dead. So they just break through, the Russians break through, and they take a huge swath of territory before they finally, Germans who have to come down and help Austria-Hungary on the Eastern Front, help stem this kind of massive, you know, loss. But Austria-Hungary loses a big chunk of their land before they finally are able to stop the Russian advance. So of course everybody in Europe is like, when they hear about this, they're like, what? How did he do it? How did he do it? And they're taking notes. So the creeping barrage with shock troops is going to become the new, you know, like phase, you know, or the new fad in the war. Like all the generals are going to like want to do it. And so of course the Germans are going to be the most kind of like organized, I guess you could say, in how they do it. So Oscar von Hutier is going to create his special stormtroopers, which are his shock troops in his version of it, and they're going to be used in some battles. By the way, can anybody figure out how do you beat shock troops? And Olivia, you had your hand up, so if you had a question, go ahead. Olivia?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I did have a question. I can understand how it was a successful campaign, but how can it be successful and devastating at the same time?
Just because you're going to lose a lot of guys, and so is the other side. So it's devastating for the Austro-Hungarian Empire for sure. And it's a big victory for the Russians, who needed a boost because people were like at the point of like, you know, like, I don't even want to be in these stupid trenches anymore. They're at the point of mutiny. So, you know, it's the Brusilov offensive, you know, is both. It just depends on your point of view, I guess. But my question is, like, how do you beat this? You know, why did he hit no man's land with shells? It seems like a waste of shells. He was trying to provide cover for who? Anyone? Yes, Faith.
He was providing cover in a way for his own troops because the Germans weren't watching the lines. They were keeping their heads down in the trenches, or the Austrians rather.
Well, and
Keeping their
also
heads down in the
it throws up so much dust. Yeah, like that it throws up so much dust you can't see if there's troops behind them. So Faith, and I see Kenzie, I see your hand too. How could you beat the creeping barrage if you know that there are troops behind all that dust that's being thrown up in the middle of no man's land? Either one of you, if you have an idea, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just having your men ready instead of like staying in the trenches, just having people, even if you were in there, having people up so that they could see who was coming, so they could warn the people in the trenches that they were coming,
Okay.
and just have supplies ready.
Okay, that's a good idea. I see
You
a
can
hand
have
from
offensive. You can have offensive inside the trenches. Like you have your weapon over the wall of the trench, and you're firing from there. But the thing is, it's kind of like a blind firing because
Okay.
you're trying to still stay sheltered.
All right.
But
And
yeah, with Kenzie saying that you should just stay prepared and not just lay back for a while and wait for the barrage to be over. You can't do that.
right, you have to do something while the barrage is going on. And I saw a hand from Scott too. I didn't know if Scott, if your idea had already been said.
Yep.
They did. Okay. But really what you do is you fire either machine guns or your own artillery right where you think the shock troops are going to be, because you can't see them because there's so much dust in the air from the explosions from the shells hitting the ground. But you know kind of where they probably will be, so you try to fire and hit them. You just fire through the all the dust and whatnot that's being thrown up, and you try and hit them. So of course, you know, for every offensive maneuver, and the reason that this one works so well is because the Austro-Hungarians just weren't expecting there to be men following the barrage. But it's a, you know, it's a very effective strategy, but of course there are countermeasures, and then of course you have to figure out how to beat the countermeasures. So that's kind of what everybody was thinking now. All right, so this goes back to something Ethan was talking about earlier with passenger ships and America and Americans dying and whatnot. So the Lusitania had really kind of riled up you know, people in this country. And on March 24th, 1916, another passenger ferry, the Sussex, was torpedoed by a German U-boat. And again, you know, it seemed like it was being used to carry more than just passengers. But President Wilson sent a communique to the French foreign minister, I'm sorry, the German foreign minister, Gottlieb von Jagow. And basically that it looked like Germany was pursuing what we call, and you might want to write this down, unrestricted submarine warfare, which means submarine warfare which doesn't respect like any ship as being off limits. Like it just will go, they go after any ship. And he says, Germany, if you do that, you are going to basically cause America to get involved in this war. Now, this is an extension of what kind of diplomacy that we've talked about with Wilson before. What is his main diplomacy towards Latin America called? It's not big stick diplomacy, and it's not dollar diplomacy. He gets involved in countries like Mexico when he's worried about human rights. What do we call that? Starts with an M.
Moral
Diplomacy. Yes, thanks, Zach. Yes, moral diplomacy. So this is an extension of moral diplomacy because, you know, he's asserting that certain ships, like passenger ships, shouldn't be attacked because it goes against, you know, the rules of warfare. You're killing all these, you know, civilians. And so Germany, which is one of the biggest powers in the world, one of the great powers, has a little minor power at the time, is what we were considered, telling them that they better not sink any more passenger ships or else they would get involved. And Germany is just like, ooh, of course, you know, at any other time we would just crush you, America. But what is their focus right now? Like we were just talking about this. What strategy are they pursuing where they're like, if we allow America to get involved, then they're going to screw this strategy up. What is their strategy that was started by General von Falkenhayn back in the Battle of Verdun?
Schlieffen Plan.
Well, not the Schlieffen Plan. This is after the Schlieffen Plan. This is like where they were trying to attack that fortress and cause the French to just use tons and tons of men to defend the fortress. And eventually, what do they hope will happen to the British and French armies? That even though the Germans are going to lose a lot of their own men, the British and the French are just going to what? Yeah, they're just going to run out of men, basically. So the strategy of attrition. So Germany like really wants to respond in a much more forceful way, but they have to kind of like basically just bite the bullet here and just be like, okay, fine. All right. We pledge not to sink any more passenger ships with our U-boats. So no more unrestricted submarine warfare. And this is what's known as the Sussex Pledge. And of course, this is going to happen in an election year, 1916. And of course, it makes Wilson look really good. Like, not only has he kept us out of this horror show over in Europe, but he also forces Germany to pledge to not sink any passenger ships. So in the campaign of 1916, Woodrow Wilson has really captured the progressive vote. The people who used to vote Republican because they loved Teddy Roosevelt's progressive policies have now all shifted over to the Democratic Party. And he, of course, also is going to, because he's incredibly racist, is going to enjoy the support of the Solid South. And the slogan that they run on, which just kind of shows you how focused people are on what's going on over in Europe, is "He kept us out of war." Now, it's one of the most ironic slogans in American political history, because like a year later, he'll get us in the war, but he's going to run on that slogan. The Republicans are still having some infighting inside of their party. Theodore Roosevelt comes back and once again tries to get the nomination, but the party says, look, what you did in 1912 was unforgivable. Like, you made us lose. Like, you took more states than the Republican Party did with your third party bid. So how can you expect us to just let you back in? You know, you have to prove that you're a good Republican first. And so Roosevelt was like, okay, fine, I'll be a good Republican and I'll go and campaign for whoever the nominee is. And they end up nominating a guy we had talked about a while back, Charles Evans Hughes, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Theodore Roosevelt went out and campaigned for him. But the problem was that Theodore Roosevelt kept making pro-war statements because he's so gung-ho. He wants to go over and fight and help the Allies. And of course, a lot of people in the country at the time don't want to fight. They're like, thank God we're not in that giant mess over there. So campaign of 1916 looks like it definitely is going to favor the Democrats. And you can see that it is actually a relatively close election here. The electoral vote is pretty close, 52% to 48%. What is the deciding state? Like, if you were looking at this and said, which state really decided it? Which state is it that went blue, that tipped it to Wilson in 1916? Anybody? Just if you had to guess, like, I mean, I know there's a lot of blue states there, but if you had to guess, which one would you say? Because it's a state that a lot of times will end up going red instead. Faith, go ahead.
Is it Ohio?
Yes, very good. It is Ohio. So Ohio really is, and it really, a lot of it has to do with the progressive vote. So the progressive vote in Ohio really saves Wilson's bid, and he is able to defeat Charles Evans Hughes and get his second term in office. So this right here is what I was referring to when, Faith, when you were talking earlier about, you know, wouldn't they like to see us get distracted with a war in Mexico? So because of the whole Pancho Villa thing, and because, you know, of our history with Mexico, where we had taken half of their country away from them, like just like 60 years prior in the Mexican-American War, Germany was like, we need to do unrestricted submarine warfare to get Britain out of the war. And if we're going to do that, we've got to get America distracted. We've got to distract them with a war on their side of the planet. So they send a message, and it's sent to the German ambassador in Mexico. His name is Arthur Zimmerman. And so the message is for him to approach the Mexican government with this offer. And the offer is that Germany wants Mexico to attack the United States and get into a full-blown war with the United States. And that if they do that, that after Germany wins in Europe, they will come across the ocean and they will help Mexico get the old half of their country back that they had lost back in the Mexican-American War, which is pretty much the western half of the United States. So if you were Mexico, would you take this offer? Would you say yes, or would you say no? Like, anybody have any thoughts on that? Like, is this a smart move on Mexico's part to say yes to this? Kenzie, go ahead.
I feel like let me see, trying to gather my thoughts. I feel like an effect would be them losing a lot of people. So of course you have your upside of getting your land back, but you're also going into war with America, who at this point is a big source of power. So if you're choosing to go in there, which is almost like suicide for them,
So you would say no
they're
if you were
most likely
Mexico.
not going to get their land back if they lose this.
Yeah, so like, but if you were Mexico, would you say yes or no to this offer? Like, say you're Mexico's president, and then Germany makes you this offer. Would you?
Obviously, at the time, without thinking about America's power, I'd say yes to get the land back. But if you think about the effects it would have on you, then I'd say no. But they probably weren't thinking about that. They probably just wanted their land back because it sounded like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the patriotic thing. Go ahead, Braden. What were you gonna say?
Well, Mexico's already kind of been slapped in a war with America, and I feel like it would just be like generally a bad move to do that, because then you would have a neighboring enemy, and that's just like, that doesn't feel like something that I would want if I were a country. Like I feel like if it were me, I would be like no, because it's like then I would have a permanent enemy right above me.
Right. And is it going to be a fair fight? I mean, really, like, if Mexico gets involved, like, are they going to be able to hold out for like a year or two, or however long it takes for Germany to win over in Europe?
Probably not.
Yeah, I would say that's probably not a smart move. And here's the other thing, which a lot of people, didn't realize at the time. Carranza owes his job to Wilson. Like, he wouldn't even be president of Mexico if it hadn't been for Wilson intervening. So he, of course he's going to say no. Like, he owes Wilson. And so, and he's still dealing with the warlords, the caudillos in his own country. And so he basically says no. And that looked like that was the end of it. Olivia, go ahead. What was your question?
I'm just wondering, I saw the next slide.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if even if the telegram wasn't sent, do you think America wouldn't have joined the war? Or
okay, well, without this, I don't know if Wilson would have had the political courage to do it, because it really raises the temperature. Because, like, okay, at this point, from what we've just discussed, this was just like a long shot. Germany was just going to try it just to see if Mexico was dumb enough to do it, and Mexico's not dumb enough to do it. So they're like, okay, fine. But here's the problem. The telegram, which was sent through Western Union, is decoded by British cryptographers, and the British military then leaks the contents of this telegram to the press. Because does Britain want America to get involved in this war? Like, would that help them a lot if America and all of its men were a part of this war? All of the factories of America were being engaged, etc. Anyone? Do you think Britain wants help? Are they like kind of like running out of guys and supplies and whatnot? Yes, Faith.
Yes, they want America involved.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So they leak this on purpose, hoping to get America involved. And when people find out that Germany tried to get Mexico to attack us, and that they promised to help Mexico get back half of our country, it really raises the temperature. Like, I mean, people are like mad. They're like angry. And so this is where a certain president is going to decide that it is time for him. This is his moment of fate. You know,
This is my slide.
Yes, yes, yes. So Boyer, this is his moment where he is, as a former history teacher, is going to get to affect history. So there is so much debate surrounding, like, you know, what the real motivations were versus what he says they are, etc. So I'm going to let you start. Go ahead.
All right. So first of all, for the most part, the United States, like the people in the United States, were pretty against going to war. In fact, he had just gotten reelected. Using the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." That was like the whole point. Like everybody was like, "Yeah, go Woodrow Wilson, no war, yeah." And then, you know, shortly after that, us going to war was kind of a culmination of just everything we've been going over the past like 10 slides. So we have one of the big things was the Lusitania, when it was sunk by the German submarine, killing 128 Americans. And, you know, I guess they kind of argued whether there was actually a military point to that, you know, whether there was munitions on board and things. But our people were still not very happy at that. And then you had the William P. Fry, which was an American vessel, like a private vessel that was, I guess, sunk by the German U-boats. And they were like, no, it was an accident, our bad, you know. But Wilson was like, really, man? Like, just private vessels now? You're just, you know, taking out everybody? So he was getting pretty mad. After just all these things together, and then especially after the Zimmerman telegram, he decided to, you know, just make plans to go to war. And so you have to ask the Senate and the House, you know?
Right. Now, so the president at this time, this is the way it worked, because we haven't had the National Security Act of 1947 where the president can kind of send in emergency forces. Congress really is the one that declares war. But the president usually asks them for a declaration of war. In his speech, he gives us some clues that make people think this is about more than just unrestricted submarine warfare, which is his technical excuse. He's like, we said don't do it, and they did it. So now we gotta back up what we said. We told them in the Sussex ultimatum, if you do unrestricted submarine warfare, we're gonna fight you. And now they've broken it, because in early 1917, Germany did just decide to break the Sussex Pledge, and they just started sinking any ship that came towards Britain. So he had his excuse, but in this speech, it really does seem like there's something else. There's some phrases in there which make people think that this is about something bigger. This is about his ideals, etc. So, Boyer, what do you think he meant by things like, we're going to make the world safe for democracy?
Yeah, so
war to end all wars.
It kind of seems like I'm trying to think of the word. He pretty much wants to spread our great democracy everywhere. You know, he wants to make the world a better place. This is the war to end all wars. We're gonna take down the bad guys, and we're gonna spread our peace and democracy everywhere. So you kind of have like that imperialism, like
that
thought going on.
But he's also like worried about who's gonna win in World War I. So if one side loses, democracy might get snuffed out over in Europe to a certain extent. In which side is that? Like, which side has a lot of autocrats on it, and which side doesn't?
I forget the name of the side, but like the Ottomans, yeah.
The Central Powers, yeah, it's an Ottoman Sultan, and then you've got the Emperor Franz Joseph, and then you've got the Kaiser, all of which are autocrats. Versus, you know, some democracies. Brady, did you have a question for Boyer?
Yeah, I did. You had said earlier in the slide that he was really against doing the war, didn't want to go to war, and eventually, you know, obviously he joined the war. I was wondering how this affected his career, since he just switched like that.
I actually don't. I don't really know what happened later. I have a feeling that the American people had been kind of swayed by that point. When you look at like the Congress votes, the Senate voted 82-6 to declare war, and let me see, the House voted 373-50. So it was very heavily go to war sided. So I have a feeling that probably starts to reflect what the people thought at the time.
Right, but there is going to be some backlash because we're going to lose a lot of men in the trenches, like a lot of men. Actually, there is some blowback. So that's actually a really good question, Brady. But we're not gonna see it until we get to the next election, and there's going to be some intervening stuff. You'll see what happens to Wilson. I'm not going to spoil it, but yeah, there is going to be some blowback because we're going to lose a lot of men, and whenever a democracy gets into war and they lose a lot of people, there's always some backlash. But let's just focus on this whole thing where you're saying, okay, what about Wilson as like as an idealist, someone who's trying to push human rights around the world? Is that how could us getting involved in World War One be an extension of moral diplomacy? Boyer, what are your thoughts there? Because I mean, those phrases kind of give you some clues. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. Who does he want to win?
I mean, the West.
He wants the Allies to win.
Yeah.
Because France is a democracy, and so is Britain. So he really wants them to win. And this will be a war to end all wars. That's a very enigmatic kind of interesting phrase. What do you think he means by that?
I think a lot of people like believed that at the time too. Like it's funny because World War II was not very long after this, but at the time I think he had convinced everybody that for us to win this war, we can, finally kind of rid the world of the final powers that are trying to take over our democracy and tear down our governments. So I think that kind of got people fired up.
Okay.
That we were going to be done with the war and done with the fighting and world peace. Everything was going to be peaceful after we just did this one war.
Okay. But think about this. This guy is a super smart PhD history professor who looks at the international system and is like, okay, there are certain things in the international system which cause wars, militarism, all these various things. I could propose what? Like, he's going to do something that no president has ever done before, and he's going to suggest some ideas which are going to change the way the world works. If America gets involved in this war, he would have an opportunity to change the international system. So, Boyer, do you know kind of what is his big policy proposal that he makes out to kind of the other powers?
I actually don't know that. I'm not sure.
We haven't really talked about it much yet. And I think in one of the classes, I may have like kind of gone ahead a little bit and kind of mentioned it. It's called the 14 points. And so he's going to basically try to fix the international system so we don't have a war again. So when he makes this phrase or when he makes this speech, people are like, what does he mean? It'll be a war to end all wars. But then later you realize he's got a way to fix the international system. And, it's a way to promote peace, protect human rights, etc. So a lot of people have taken away from this that Wilson is this great believer in ideals. Like, it goes against his political interests. Like you were saying, Boyer, politically, the smart thing to do is to stay out of it. Like, why would you get yourself involved in a war where you're going to suffer political damage? So a lot of people think he's just this idealist. He's a history professor who sees what must be done to fix the international order. And this is going to give him that opportunity, that one chance to get the rest of the world to listen to America and make these fixes as a part of the peace treaty at the end. Of course, it'll make sure that the Allies, which are by far the more benign of the two sides, win. But there are other people who say nope, that's not his motivation.
You froze up.
Go ahead. Go ahead. What were you going to say? Boyer? Boyer? Are you able to talk?
You were frozen for like
Oh, okay.
like 30 seconds there.
Oh, sorry about that. All right. So, what do you think the people who don't believe he's an idealist, what do you think their argument is? Like, what is this speech all about? The war to make the world safe for democracy, a war to end all wars. What is he really doing here?
I mean, it is kind of like a nationalist, imperialist kind of idea. Like, let's spread America's greatness. You know, it wasn't necessarily about, you know, the benefit of everybody. It was more about the benefit of the United States and building a great, you know, empire that protected the world.
Ooh, but remember, he's an anti-imperialist. He's like, I don't want um, America to own anything. As a matter of fact, he was like trying to make it so we didn't own things. And under him, they're going to pass a law to eventually give the Philippines their freedom, I believe, which won't happen for a while. It's called the Jones Act. But like they have to like wait for like 20 years before they actually do it. But what else? I mean,
I'm not really sure.
yeah, I mean, this is one of those things because it's like, okay, if he's such a great human rights believer, why is he such a racist? It always comes back to that. Like, how can you be so intellectually inconsistent? Like, how can you say, I believe in human rights, I believe in democracy and freedom and making the world a safe place and making sure democracy flourishes all over the planet so the people are happy, and yet be incredibly racist towards black people? Like, how can those two things go together? So what the historians who don't think Wilson is an idealist believe is that this is all just an attempt to manipulate people, and to get them feeling all patriotic and noble, like we're going to do a good thing for the rest of the world kind of thing, and puts it all in this democratic and flowery language to get people excited about being involved. But really, his real motivation is he wants to engineer the international system in a way that benefits America and will accomplish some of the goals that he has long term for the world. So it is kind of an interesting debate that goes on there. Boyer, did you get anything on the Selective Service Act, which is on this slide, and just kind of preparation for the war? So go ahead, tell us.
I was about to say, so this was, I believe this was the first time that we had like an official draft to get men into the military.
I mean, there was
I
one
think
during the Civil War, but this is like the first time that it's established where it never goes away. Like you still, as a young person, have you signed up for the Selective Service yet, Boyer? I mean, have you guys hit, or you haven't hit?
No, I think when you hit 18, you
18.
have to.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
I had to do it when I became 18 years old. So like you'll have like all of the guys, you guys are all going to have to do that. Because they won't give you loans for college or anything if you don't.
And we'll see. I think there some organization is like suing the government, saying that it goes against like gender rights not to have women in the draft. So
right.
We'll see how that goes.
But then that begs the question of, well, who's going to stay home with all the people like who need to be supervised, like the kids and everything? So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And then, it's a little difficult to do that when the PT test for women is like a third of the PT test for men. So then you got that whole thing going on, and it just doesn't work. But everybody's still going to get mad about it.
Anybody want to bring up the other side of that argument, because it is kind of an interesting debate. Boyer's ready. He's ready to go. All right. Well, you don't have any takers, Boyer. But yeah, tell us about the Selective Service Act. Like, what are the parameters? Like, who can be drafted? What ages?
Okay, so it's I believe it's 18 is like the point at which you can be drafted in. It might have been 21.
Okay, I can clear
remember.
that up for you. So essentially, it starts out at from ages 21 to 35 are the ages, because generally people are younger and more single and haven't started families yet, etc. A lot of them have, but so 21 to 35. But then in times of need, they can extend it outward, and they can go down to age 18 and up to age 45. So in World War II, when we're fighting on two fronts, we're fighting the Nazis over in Europe and we're fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, they will actually use that part of it, use that part of the draft. And 18-year-olds are going to get drafted and sent to the Pacific. They literally would, as soon as they turned 18, would get drafted. Like they'd be in high school still, and they'd say, well, you know, you'll graduate when you come back. But you know, if
And it was like, yeah, it was there was a lot of like backlash to it. And there was some people called it like the lottery of death,
yes,
because they would have I believe they did it off of like age. I know during World War II they did it off of when you were born, like your birth date.
yes.
And they would kind of, you know, like you're watching the lottery at night with your grandma sitting on the couch, like they'd roll the little balls around the little lottery like ping pong balls, and they'd grab one out and it'd be like, all right, you know, 19 whatever year, and then the month, and then the day, and then everybody that had that birthday or everybody that was in that month was drafted for the military. But it caused a lot of people to just enlist. A lot of people, when the draft came up, enlisted. So a couple months after the draft, the Selective Service Act was signed, around 10 million men across the country had.
Oh, you froze, Boyer. Are you able to talk? You're kind of frozen still. Oh, you were frozen for like about 10 seconds there. Can you?
You froze up again.
Yeah, so you were saying about 10 million people from around the country, or 10 million men from around the country did what now?
Okay, you just unfroze.
Yeah. So repeat that part about 10 million men from around the country enlisted.
So a few months after the Select Service Act was signed, around 10 million men from the United States had already registered, just in response to the draft being signed.
Yeah, and there was a ton of public pressure on people to not avoid the draft. People who tried to dodge it were like, you know, basically pilloried as cowards in American society. There was a special name they had for people who dodged it. I'm trying to remember what it is. I can't right off the top of my head, but like they would publicly shame men who wouldn't go when they were drafted, like who were actively trying to dodge it.
Yeah, I think that's a big deal with, I know there's been scandals from like 15 different like government people these days where they're like, man, you tried to avoid the draft at one point, and you know
that has to do with Vietnam, which is a whole nother
yeah.
ballpark. Yeah,
And there's so many people that have been accused of it, and of course that's like the biggest shame you can put on somebody. Like they, you know, they're trying to tell you that they served the country, but when the time came, they wouldn't even, you know, go risk their life to defend the country.
well, you're not a man if you're a coward, right?
Yeah.
So, right. That was especially true back at this time. Now, of course, when we get to Vietnam, a lot of people really disagree with that war. Max, you had your hand up a while back. Did you have something you wanted to add when we were talking about like the age 18 thing and all that?
I was gonna ask the public response to the draft, but then as soon as I raised the hand, Boyer answered it. So
All right, okay. I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss a good question there. All right. So, all right, Boyer, did you have anything else on us joining the war?
So just a little specific on the Selective Service Act. 24 million men registered under the Selective Service Act. 4.8 million eventually served, and of the 4.8, 2.8 had been drafted. So, you know, over half of the people that served were not enlisted. They were just drafted in. So just random people. Over half our military was just random guys that had been drafted in.
Yep, and you just had to bring them in, boot camp them real quick, and send them. Yeah. So, this is a big moment for us because we're stepping out onto the world stage at a critical moment in the history of the European war. Like, this is a war between the great powers, and it's at a really close kind of, you know, like something can tip it one way or the other, and America stepping in is us kind of, you know, putting our hand on the scale, trying to tip things in the favor of one side of the great powers. So this is where we really step on the world stage. Like, this is a big moment for us internationally, and of course it is going to be a lot more painful than we expected it to be. Now, just to show you how maybe not idealistic Wilson was, we have some laws that are passed by Congress, which he signs into law, which really restrict free speech dramatically. The first one is the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it a crime to convey information that interfered with or intended to interfere with the success of the armed forces of the United States, and made such actions punishable by 20 years in jail or a $10,000 fine. So that, like, for instance, there were people who spoke out against the draft, etc. Those people could be arrested under the Espionage Act. But what gets even worse is kind of an addendum onto that that gets passed in 1918 called the Sedition Act of 1918, which basically says that even if you say something where you are criticizing the government, disloyal speech, you can be you could basically can be thrown in jail for that. And Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, and J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Department of Justice General Intelligence Office, use these laws to crack down on leftists because they saw leftists as kind of like the center of dissent. Yes, go ahead, Faith.
Isn't that like really bad against the First Amendment rights? You couldn't just say, you know, this war kind of sucks. I don't think we should have gotten involved, and some dude can just arrest you?
Yeah, like it's a violation of the First Amendment for sure. So if somebody had challenged one of these cases and one of these laws, and these will be challenged, by the way, and it goes up to the Supreme Court, you would expect the Supreme Court to say this is a violation of the First Amendment. But again, in times of war, you know, you can make the argument that extraordinary measures, you know, extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. All right, so this takes us to the Creel Committee on Public Information, which again calls into question how idealistic Wilson really is if he's willing to go this far. Essentially, the Creel Committee is propaganda. This is essentially where the American government on purpose is trying to manipulate the public into supporting the war, which is very typical of governments. I mean, propaganda is nothing new. So you can see some posters here, you know, America's answer, you know, beat back the Hun, you know, the German was still called the Hun, with Liberty bonds. Serbia needs our help, you know, poor Serbia, which had been conquered in 1915, needs our help. So it's all these appeals to people's kind of like, you know, good intentions and altruism and things like that. And they bring in this advertising exec who is very, very capable, named George Creel, to kind of run this. But George Creel goes further than just your usual wartime propaganda. He basically goes into racism. He actually promotes anti-German kind of racist, you know, attitudes in the country. And German towns had to change their names in order to avoid being attacked by people, which was actually being encouraged by the government. And many German Lutheran churches were burned down as people, you know, just became incredibly anti-German. So the Creel Committee has gone down in history as kind of one of the not so nice things that our government has done. And of course, it's because of their active promotion, not only their manipulation of the American people through propaganda, but their active promotion of racism to kind of whip up, you know, people's support for the war and against the Germans. Now, on the home front, the World War I basically is different than any other war. There's a number of laws that are passed which bring all of the resources of America, every facet of American society, into kind of rationing, so that the troops will have enough supplies, they'll have enough food, etc. So here are the ways in which the government interferes in the economy in a big way during the war. The U.S. Shipping Board is set up as a 5-man board to build, purchase, and lease ships. And sometimes people would just have their ships. The government would say, "We need your ship for the war," and they say, "Well, I don't want to sell it." And they'll say, "You are going to sell it, and if you don't sell it, we're just going to take it." So the War Industries Board was set up in July of 1917 under Bernard Baruch, who will later become famous under FDR, which set priorities for resources, prices, and designated plants that were going to be converted over to war industry. So they would just tell businesses, "You're going to make guns now." And they'll be like, "Well, we don't want to." And they'll be like, "Too bad. You're making guns now. You're making this, you're making that." The Lever Food and Fuel Control Act was passed in 1917, and it established the Food Administration under the guy who had headed up the Committee for Belgian Relief, Herbert Hoover. And this basically rationed food. So there was a certain ration of food that every American was allowed to have, and beyond that, you just couldn't have more than your ration. And the National War Labor Board said to labor unions, "Look, we know that companies are going to basically say, well, we're going to have to lower wages and stuff. You can't strike during the war. Like, everybody has to be on board." So they basically stopped strikes, and people had to work longer hours for less money in order to help out the country. And that takes us to the changing role of women.
This is my slide.
All right. So, Kenzie, I'm going to let you start. This is a super important slide. So go ahead, and then I'll jump in occasionally when necessary.
Okay, so as men were being drafted into the war, women were left behind, and up until now, women were expected to take on the role of a housewife and mother, but as men were being drafted into the war, women were forced to do more and change their role in society. They had to take on jobs that men would usually do, and that included also helping in the war. So jobs included nurses, ammunition factory workers, sewing bandages and selling war bonds, shipyards, and spies. In addition, 8 million women volunteered as American Red Cross workers in a variety of capacities in making surgical dressings, masks, and gowns. Women were devoted to helping men and helping the war effort. The government had called upon women to keep the home fires burning. Thousands of women responded and were happy to do more than they had been. Women saw that they weren't as frail as they had thought, and they were capable of much more. Women were starting to think about their role in society more as a result. Although it did a lot for women and their changing role and growing confidence, it was met with challenges. Seeing that women were filling men's roles and working in factories, accidents were happening that injured and killed a lot of women. And although men were in the war fighting and the women behind the scenes, and although men were in the war fighting, the women behind the scenes should be credited just as much for helping the war efforts, because they did a lot of the factory jobs and helped distribute just supplies and get them the things they needed to help. A notable woman who helped in the war was Julia Hunt Caitlin Toffley. I probably pronounced that wrong. A socialite and philanthropist born in Maine. She was the first American woman to be awarded the French Croix de Guerre in Louisiana
Croix de Guerre.
For converting the Chateau d'Anel into a 300-bed hospital near the front line.
Okay. This is really important because this is where the spell is broken. Men had told women for a really, really long time, ever since the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, that they were too what to handle factory work?
They were too fragile.
Too fragile, too frail. You're not strong enough. You're emotionally not capable of like dealing with what factory work is all about. And women had accepted this. Mothers taught their daughters, grandmothers, reinforced it. And every person that a girl looked up to her whole life always told her, look, your place is in the home. men are the ones that go and work in factories. But now that men were being drafted in huge numbers and enlisting, there just weren't enough men to fill the factory jobs. So women had to go to the factories. It was just a necessity. What did they discover about factory work when they got there? Like, is it as bad as men were making it seem?
It isn't as bad, actually.
Yes. Okay. So women realized we've been believing a lie. Like, this is what finally makes a lot of women start listening to the suffragist movement, which has been going for, a really long time, over 70 years at this point, and they just can't get women to wake up. They just can't get women to snap out of it. Most women are like, you people are weird. Now the women are realizing, we have been bamboozled, we've been fooled, we've been snookered, like this is easy. I mean, we can do it. It's not super easy, but it's doable. Like, so more than anything else, you're going to see that this is going to really shift women away from that role that they had been in, that domestic sphere. This is what breaks the spell of the domestic sphere more than any other factor. And then, of course, in the 1920s, you're going to see this. Not only are you going to see the 19th Amendment get passed, where women will finally get the right to vote, but you're also going to see the flapper movement and just kind of this general rebellion by women against the entire kind of structure that men had set up. So that is a huge, huge kind of turning point in women's history.
Yes, and I believe I saw something when I was looking into this earlier that there had been women that were in the war, but not everywhere. It was only like certain places. I don't recall the places that it was, but I had seen that women had been in the war.
Yes, and there are occasional women who fight. Now, when we get to World War II, women are going to be in the military in a much more significant way, but there are some women who participate. Mostly right now it's through the nursing profession, but there are those occasional women who do more than that. So thank you, Kenzie, and that takes us to Jeanette Rankin, which I know somebody has.
This is my slide.
Okay, so go ahead, Elizabeth.
So Jeanette Rankin, what she's really known for is being the first woman to be elected to federal office. But her political career really began when she started volunteering with women's suffrage campaigns. And she was the first woman to address the Montana state legislature, and then she testified in support of women's suffrage. And actually when she ran for House of Representatives in Montana, women were allowed to vote there. So that kind of helped her a little bit.
Yeah.
But
now, some states, especially Western states, allowed it earlier than the 19th Amendment.
But one challenge that she really faced in her campaign was the Anaco Copper Company, which owned a lot of newspapers in Montana, deliberately ignored her campaign and suppressed the amount of reach she was able to have. And after she won, the press didn't really take her all that seriously. They asked her a lot about her clothes and recipes and what color her hair was, silly stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just because they didn't take her seriously. She voted against declarations of war in both world wars. And she got slammed by the press for this. She was called a dagger in the hands of the German propagandists. And even the women's suffrage associations distanced themselves from her to protect their own image.
Yeah. Now, when was her vote against war the most controversial?
The most controversial one was World War II because she was the only vote in the House of Representatives against it.
Because Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor galvanized the country. We had been hit, they took out our Pacific Fleet. And so she's the only, so she does have a reputation for being a pacifist. But like you were saying, Kenzie, she often didn't get taken seriously on policy because she was a woman. Men just were like, you don't have anything to really contribute to policy debates, when she often did. Some of her positions were actually positions that later people would be like, well, actually, we probably should have done that. So yes, thank you. And I do believe we have hit the time limit, so we are out of time. So thanks everybody for participating today, and I have you all marked down, and I'll get those points in the book for you, and I will see you next week. Does anybody know, by the way, if Monday is a B day or an A day? Was Friday the remote day? Was that an A day?
Friday was an A day, so Monday
Friday was
should be a B day.
It should be a B day on Monday. Okay. Well, then I will see you guys on Monday. Have a great rest of your weekend.